All right, welcome everybody. My name's John Buck, and I'm joined with Struan and Trygve as part of like the Devry collaborative movement or whatever. We wanted to sort of like discuss something that was no, some whatever topic was sort of that was of interest to all three of us. And so I think we sort of like settled somewhat on like what postmodernism is, or how postmodernism has sort of affected society. We might like dive into ethics and epistemology, or I don't know. It's going to be a sort of free floating thing. It's kind of we'll see where the wind blows us. So go ahead and say hello, both of you guys.
Okay. Hi.
Hello, everyone.
I know, Struan, you had some quite harsh words to say on postmodernism when we were talking with Brett that one time following the Maps of Meaning sort of final episode.
So we're jumping right in the landmines, are we?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the real question is when you're engaging with someone else and speaking to them, are they engaging in good faith? And I would say that generally postmodernism does not engage in good faith. And that makes it very, very difficult to entertain what people say using a postmodernist lens very seriously.
Yeah, to rephrase that a little bit, I think you're mostly right, but we should be concise. We're talking about postmodernists, and postmodernism facilitates, since it's a purely cynical theory, it makes people never assume the best about anyone except themselves, maybe. So,
Right.
so they're basically obligated to not engage in good faith.
Well,
Right.
if we're going to be specific in that way, then I would actually draw a distinction between the postmodernist philosophers and then the political movements which have a broadly postmodernist dispensation, because those aren't one and the same thing. And if you try and speak about the political movements that we see today in terms of the postmodernists, then well, all the people that are favorable to postmodernism will just jump all over you and shred you to pieces for saying that. So
Yeah, that
just
is
thought
true.
I'd get that out there.
Yeah, it's interesting because you sort of have the more academic types, and that's kind of the thing is like postmodernism has sort of this stranglehold over academia within like or social studies and the humanities sectors. But there's the other component of postmodernism, which is like who are the types of people employing postmodern thought in order to sort of get their way within other domains as well. Sort of like the whole evergreen fiasco, at least to me, seems like it's sort of the primary example of what postmodernism is in practice, which is
Yeah.
using all the same ideas from the actual philosophies and the academics that sort of put it forward. But the way in which it's used is sort of, I guess, I don't know if it's a catch-all, but like a mode in which you can utilize in order to get whatever that you want, or they can at least try to get whatever they want.
Yeah, someone called it applied postmodernism. I can't remember exactly who that was. I think it
That's
might have been
Lindsay and
Stephen
Pluckrose.
Hicks. Sorry?
Lindsay and Pluckrose.
Oh, yeah, I
James
haven't heard
Lindsay.
that name before. So,
James
Okay.
Lindsay.
yeah.
There are two names: James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose is who he's
Yeah.
referring to.
Oh, Helen. Right. Oh, is it them? Okay. Sorry, I was thinking Stephen Hicks, but if it's Lindsay and Pluckrose and what's the other one?
Peter Boghossian.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. That's his name. Those
Yeah.
three, yeah.
Yeah, I should say I'm not quite as familiar with postmodernism just because I've had a purely, I guess, individualistic education. And so like I haven't had to interact with any of the postmoderns in the different education sectors. So maybe you guys will be more familiar with it. But so like the only ways I'm really familiar with it is through the different uh, ways it
Criticisms.
sort of, yeah, through the criticisms by like Peterson and Pluckrose and Lindsay and some of that. And
Company.
yeah, a little bit of like, I guess if you say that Nietzsche is sort of the father of postmodernism, or like the the estranged father, maybe.
Yeah, something like that. Both
Yeah.
ends.
So I can sort of like understand, I guess, the what leads to postmodernism. Like if I was to say like what sort of leads to postmodernism is the skepticism towards having knowledge. And if we can't have knowledge, then what is it we're doing when we're actually like talking about ideas and putting forward institutions and things like that. Well, these are sort of extensions of our own personalities and of our own desires. And so when we're actually like talking about truth and what we ought to do and things like that, we're just expressing ourselves in whatever way we think can attain more power for ourselves, like the will to power
or express our power.
struggles. Yes, yeah. Or ways in which to sustain our power as well, because that's the thing
To
too,
shape
like,
the world around us.
and it's funny, you can kind of see this as well, that like it's almost like a well, like sophists, like you can establish this methodology for argumentation that sounds like you're actually like putting forward some sort of like position, when in fact you're just establishing or sorry, you sort of like worked out all these sort of chess moves of how you can talk about things to make it seem like you're actually playing the game with the other person, but you're only doing it in order to sort of win. And that is sort of like the postmodern way of thinking about how all these sorts of, like, whenever we're actually talking about truth and justice and beauty and things like that, we're talking about things that can help us in ascertaining whatever it is that we're wanting.
Yeah, there's no real distinction to postmodernism, so there's no limitation on what you can do, which is legitimate in a contest of wills, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is allowed because nothing can be made illegal without someone taking advantage of it.
That's sort of the weird, I don't know, maybe contradictory or dichotomous thing within postmodernism, is like within Nietzsche's thought, it's like the will to power is sort of this ultimate good in some sense. Whereas within postmodern thinking, it's almost like flipped on its head still, where if you are the most marginalized or the most oppressed, then you have this sort of ultimate superiority or moral worth, I guess. And so it sort of like becomes this competition of like, what sort of status position do I have? Because that means whatever I say has highest priority in establishing what rules of law ought to be moved forward. And it just to sort of like, I guess at least touch on to religion, it seems almost like a parasitization of the humanistic thought within Christianity, where like within Christianity you have the idea of like those that are the lowest of the low are worthy to be brought into the fold. They're part of the community. It seems like postmodernism is almost like an extension of that, where like the lowest of the low are the best of us, and so like whatever.
Yeah, that comes from Hegel.
Really?
Yeah. It's something from Hegel that I actually brought up on Twitter the other day, because it seems like that might become impossible to talk about on Twitter without changing the terms. Hegel had this idea called the master-slave dialectic, in which the master had some knowledge and the slave had some knowledge, and the slave also had to know the master's knowledge, and therefore the slave was superior in terms of access to knowledge.
That's
and
interesting.
that is so that's the basis of what's called standpoint epistemology today. And when applied to all kinds of different identities, following, for example, Engels applying it to men and women, or critical race theorists applying it to the races, or all those kinds of things, heteronormativity and so on. Following those, all put together, you basically get the idea that there's no point in listening to anyone except the most oppressed.
That's interesting, because there's a way in which I can sort of make sense. Like the people that are on the marginalized of society, they know how they ought to behave within the broader community, but they also can have their own sort of more specific community that they use, that they rely upon. Within the Black community, it's called code switching, I think, where you have your vernacular and your way of speaking when you're around white people, and then you have your normal, ebonics, just the way of speaking around fellow Black people.
Yeah.
And it sort of makes sense that like when you're part of a smaller community within a broader community, you have to understand how the broader community works. But and then you also have your other community, which is on the margins, and so you do see like where the broader system fails, and that's definitely a thing that happens. Like on the margins, there is more chaos, and so that's where the domains, the systems that normally work for the average or the mean of people on that sort of bell curve.
Something that, by the way, doesn't actually exist. It's just a construct. It doesn't actually exist. There is no mean. There's no average. It's just a mathematical number. So yeah, on average, in fact, everybody is a minority. Absolutely everybody lives in a, you might say, to use the postmodern terms here, a local discourse within their own families that they have to know how it operates in addition to the society around them.
Is that kind of like what Peterson goes into, that like when you take all the what is the postmodern term where you have all the stacking of marginalization or whatever, the progressive stack, that like there's all these intersectionality, that's it, the intersections of like different ways in which you're oppressed, and there's an infinite many different ways in which you're going to be oppressed in many different ways, even if you're sort of like on Capitol Hill and you have a good job and a good wife and things like that. There's other different sort of ways in which you're going to be struggling.
Which is where it gets wicked in postmodernism, because the only reason to only look at the identities they look at is power. There's no other reason, and that's the only reason they give. That's why they think people focus on things they focus on. So by their own account, they are doing the thing they say is bad. Yeah, and in more ways than one. But let's talk about that one first.
Yeah, it's the interesting way, because in some ways, like it's a highly useful, I guess, way of thinking, because a framework of only power is basically a broad enough framework that you can you can interpret everything by that framework. Yeah. Like there's all these power relations that are going on all the time in many different sorts of ways. But it does make it interesting, because if you're saying that power is inherently sort of wrong, especially the way in which like whoever has more power than those below them, they're automatically immoral in comparison to those that are below them.
Less valuable, I think, is more accurate.
It's interesting because it is like a relativistic morality that's based upon like, okay, the power differentials, whoever has less power in a situation is automatically right because they're the one that's going to be suffering more so, and the other one can, I guess, sort of take it, I guess.
Yeah. And in that regard, it doesn't consider human reflexivity at all, because of course, when you give people authority based on them not having power, you give them power. And what happens then? The whole structure flips.
Yeah. It's funny. Yeah, go ahead, Struan.
What I would say there is that the postmodernists are explicitly trying to get rid of the hierarchy itself. They want everything to be flat, and so therefore they see their championing of the oppressed as a means to an end, because lifting the people at the bottom will make things closer to being completely equal.
Well, I will say there are actually two kinds here we're talking about. So one kind that wants to flip it, and one kind that wants to flatten everything, basically. And they are basically identical except for what they're trying to achieve. They follow different schools.
I think that the thing is that they're actually trying to achieve the same things, even if they disagree on what they're trying to achieve, because in practice they behave the same way. Because how are you going to flatten out all of the inequalities except by actually going and flattening everything out?
Yeah, but the point here is that because they have different aims, you get different kinds of people going in there. So you get the people who want revenge, who want their time in the sun because they've been oppressed, or their forefathers have been oppressed, or so they think. And you get the people who want to make everything fair in the future.
I think that's one and the same thing. I don't see the distinction between those two. I think psychologically, the one motivation is the other motivation.
So you don't see a difference between being motivated by revenge and being motivated by
fairness,
by equality? I mean, well, I can see why I would think that, but that's what you're saying.
Well, if you study the history, then, like, for example, the very idea of sin or guilt comes from the word of debt, and like the idea was that if you killed somebody else, you had a blood debt, and that was your guilt, and you had to discharge your debt to the other person in order to make things equal again. Like our oldest notions of justice are basically built upon this idea of balancing the scales. So it's not. So yeah, I don't really see a distinction between the desire to balance the scales and the desire to get revenge insofar as you think that the revenge is justified. Like the idea that the revenge is justified is something that you see in everybody who goes for revenge. They always like the justification is precisely the balancing of the scales. Like it's one of the oldest ideas that societies have. We developed these ideas way back in the Bronze Age, and it's that
sure.
postmodernism is using that in a way to undermine our current ideas of what justice should be. They basically say your justice isn't justice.
Yeah, but, and this is kind of important here, you have the kind of postmodernism which they time beyond all of these hierarchies, that they want to flatten them and then build something entirely new without any of the oppressive structures. That's what some of them envision, and that's very different from, for example, the kind of person who would want to and actively pursue something like reparations. For one, the revenge part of it would be a strategy, and for the other, the revenge part would be the goal.
I don't see the distinction.
Yeah,
I don't.
At least maybe it is the case that, sort of like drawing from Peterson and his like analysis of Jung, that where you can see that somebody has some sort of stated explicit goal, and then through practice we can witness that, oh, they're acting in ways that would not actually be conducive towards that goal, which makes me wonder if there is some sort of implicit goal that maybe they don't even realize that is much more maleficent or malevolent in its motivations.
That's a fair suggestion, but I think it's lost be noting here that when we're looking at these kinds of movements, they don't just involve the people who are supposedly aggrieved, at least not along any given axis. The reason for the people who are not part of the given aggrieved group to care, to fight for the same cause, is this larger vision. So you have the people who want revenge for their cause, and you have the people who want revenge for their cause, and you have the people who want revenge for their cause, and the reason for them to go together is this larger vision of a perfectly equal future beyond the revenges. So you don't get the amalgamated movement without this bigger picture.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because that's kind of the weird thing, I guess, that I see within postmodernism, or it's not like we're using postmodernism, but that's like just the philosophical kind of mindset, when in fact, like what we're referring to is much broader than just the academic. We're sort of talking about practical, the practice of postmodernism.
We have been really irresponsible here. We should have defined the word first.
Yeah, sorry. But the thing that is, I guess, confusing, I guess, to me is how many of the vocal proponents of postmodern thinking and trying to establish these goals of postmodernism are people that are part of the, I guess, master class, or the master dialectic. Like they're generally white people that have some sort of inherent guilt, I guess, to them that they're trying to alleviate, and maybe this is the avenue in which they're trying to take. But it's funny, I don't know how funny it is, but the way in which they try to, I guess, express their pure intents to the goals of postmodernism is through like self-hatred towards, it's not even self-hatred, but it is hatred towards your own culture. So like if you're white and cis, and in order to sort of make sure that you can be trustworthy, I guess, within the postmodern goal set, is to publicly decry the white crimes that have been committed all throughout the past, and many things along with that.
Even the ones that were committed by white people.
I'm not sure if I would agree with that characterization, because I don't think that, like, yes, you can talk about obviously like the Black Lives Matter movement in the way that it has metastasized has like all of the hallmarks of postmodernism. But once you get the people in the streets, professing the guilt and attacking the police and so on and so forth, that's not postmodernist anymore. That's something more general. It's like you see the same behaviors in, well, it was the political correctness of let's say, China and Russia, where people who had the wrong kinds of dogma were basically purged. That behavior that we're seeing, although it was provoked by postmodernism, isn't. I wouldn't say it's like postmodernist per se. It's like
actually it is.
Well, I would say that's a perennial sort of human problem in that, like, wherever there is some sort of in-group out-group dynamic, the out-group is what gets purged first.
Yeah, but at the same time, it actually is a postmodern thing because of the way they understand discourses. So discourses are what humans live in and understand the world through, and they are loosely connected, and it's basically all kinds of meaning that we interact with, and everything we should care about according to postmodernism exists in discourses. And so what they're trying to do is control the discourses.
Right.
Yes, but the average person on the street who's busy out there protesting doesn't know a thing about discourses. That's not something that's on their
They don't need to, but you'll find that a lot of them understand enough.
I mean, I think there is, like, even on the street, there is this understanding that you're platforming somebody whose ideas are reprehensible, and so ought not to be platformed in the way that you are. Even by, like, having free speech within your society, you're in a way approving of the things that people are saying, or because you're providing the platform for which these ideas can spread. Because that's the thing. There's no, like, autonomy to the individual. It's just they are a extension of the ideas that are spread, that are out there.
Right, but I think what the distinction I'm trying to draw is that the person who's out there on the street saying, well, white people are guilty of systemic racism and everything, that person doesn't care about postmodernism. That person cares about racism. Like, although they're using a postmodernist idea of what racism is, and I don't discount, like, it's heavily postmodernist in the way that it manifests, but the person on the street isn't actually caring about the postmodernism. Like, we shouldn't apply all of the like, we shouldn't reduce it to one particular motive is what I'm trying to say.
For sure. And again, we're discussing postmodernism, we're discussing something in its pure form, a term that is appropriate here as it is about religions. Most adherents to religion don't understand, say, more than 10% of how religion actually functions. They don't understand their justifications, they have no idea about the arguments for it, and so they can't actually defend it if challenged. And it's the same thing for postmodernism because it functions in essentially the same way as the most structures of thought that are as coherent and complete as it.
Well, I would actually argue that postmodernism is explicitly designed to destroy any kind of potential to have the conversation that a religious person might be requested to engage in, by virtue of the fact that they are asked to justify their beliefs. Like, in other words, you can imagine a religious person being questioned on their beliefs and then having an answer, but the postmodernist sees that entire game and their answers are structured in such a way to destroy the game from even being played in the first place. That's the difference.
That's a really interesting point because, like, within Christianity, explicitly, it's a religion that is based around proselytizing, and so in order to proselytize your faith, you have to understand what do they believe and how can I translate what I believe into what they can believe so that it makes sense and I can convert them. Whereas within, I think, postmodernism, it is purely in-group based, where, like, okay, if you indoctrinate the children while they're young, you can instill this sort of, like, way of thinking about racial inequalities and injustices that are taking place, and from there that can spring forth this, I guess, I'm using, I don't know, I think I'm sort of like explaining them in using these sorts of definitions that are much more, I don't know, on a harsher tone than I'm trying to get across, because I think.
Can I help?
Yeah. Go right ahead.
So what I would say is that the postmodernists, well, we're basically talking about deconstruction here, I would say. But sure. Postmodernism generally, how it assaults modernism is that it says that modernism doesn't live up to its own standards. So it doesn't actually explicitly adopt any standards. Rather, it undermines standards in terms of it always finds a performative contradiction. And
I wanted to push back a little bit because I think there is some aspect of postmodernism that does have sort of like a coherent system of thought. But you're right that it's not a coherent system of thought that can be translated into other coherent systems of thought so that there's some sort of like integration that can take place, but rather oh, this is our way of thinking and we're building up from there. And we have like specific texts that we can be using as propaganda machines or just being able to understand the position itself. Like from Derrida and Foucault and Robert and D'Angelo and different people like that, and this is sort of their texts that they use in order to sort of understand their own positions. But you're right, it's not something that can be translated over into the outgroup.
Well, what I would say in this regard is that I mostly agree, but what I would say is that the postmodernists, like insofar as deconstruction is a thing, they deconstruct modernism, and in the deconstruction of modernism, they don't actually build anything new, but the point that they leave you at is what the postmodernist is trying to achieve. So that you have, so all of these knowledge systems have been disintegrated, and then from that position of unknowing, everything is more or less equal, let's say, because the hierarchies no longer make sense.
I saw Trygve, you shared a link to a paper.
Yeah. It's Nicholas Shackle in his he coined the term Mott Bailey. He was describing postmodernism and its philosophical mess, really. He described it as alegogia, the kind of perspective they take on truth and so on. So it's in direct opposition to the kind of logo supremacy that I would argue for example, and that I think we all aspire to live in. It's a pretty interesting article. Just figured you might like to have it. Might also want to put it in the description, though. But I don't think we'll look closer on it. But I think it might be worth being aware of.
All right, so just to read the abstract to sort of give people an idea, many of the philosophical doctrines purveyed by postmodernists have been roundly refuted, yet people continue to be taken in by the dishonest devices used in proselytizing for postmodernism. I exhibit, name, and analyze. Yeah. 5 favorite rhetorical maneuvers: Troll's truism, Mott and Bailey doctrines, equivocating fulcra, the postmodernist foxtrot, and rankly relativizing fields. Anyone familiar with postmodernist writings will recognize their pervasive hold on the dialectic of postmodernism and come to judge that dialectic as it ought to be judged. Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that are so fundamentally problematic, let's say, with postmodernism is that as a structure, it is a no position. The position that is taken is always implicit. It's not openly advocated for. It's rather by omission, the only one that is not argued against. And what usually follows then is something like what the person who deconstructed something else already believed. Let's say, if you have some kind of Marxist engaging in deconstruction, they won't be as focused on the sides of Marx that they still use in their thought. They might be trying to engage in the kind of philosophizing with a hammer that Nietzsche tries to do, or however you want to interpret it. But the things that are not looked at are the things that go on. And one of the things that happen in this process is, of course, that they relativize everything because they question all the big narratives and conflate science with the rest of them for reasons that I don't want to go into right now. And consequently, they see no difference between indoctrination and education.
Right.
Because it's all relative, and they have no solid basis besides power. So you decide what is truth, and so on. And consequently, people who are trained in this tradition, they won't be able to tell any difference. So it's all about power, and everything is relative to nothing, actually, because it can't be relative without also being objective.
Right. All of our categories and systems of thought are socially constructed that we're living within, like gender's social construct and many of the general gender roles and different like ways in which we ought to be living. These are just sort of like religious or inherited sorts of behaviors that we're still relying upon.
And so the position of the opposition, among other things, becomes the position of the blank slate, which is basically never openly argued for, but is absolutely rather refuted.
Right. And I think the distinction, because that's the thing, like Steven Pinker, he has this, like 1,800 page book or whatever on the blank slate, which is like soundly refuting all of the conceptions of the blank slate. But I think the key point that he's maybe like missing is that the blank slate isn't a descriptive position. It's an idealistic position of how people ought to be. So like if we treat people like they're a blank slate, that's the way in which we can sort of like get our way across.
I think I don't think I agree with that. I think that the blank slate, like the postmodernists argue strongly for a social constructionist position only because the modernist position favors objectivity, and the social construction argument is an argument against objectivity. But I don't think that there's any particular kind of allegiance to the idea of blank slate notions or social constructions as such. It's just a means to an end for the postmodernist.
They don't get any kind of activism. They don't get to call anything unfair without relying on the blank slate, because it's by means of the blank slate that inequalities become inequities. If you understand what I'm saying. So you look at disparities, for example, in arrests of people of different groups, say men and women, and you look at that and you think, okay, so men and women are not the same. Therefore, this might be something other than just police treating people unfairly.
Right.
But if you assume that they are the same, which is what you do with the blank slate, then suddenly it becomes unfair.
I see. So yeah, that I guess kind of makes a little bit more sense of like how we can establish that there is some sort of discrepancy or inequality that's taking place is by first assuming that everybody is equal in all of their traits and things like that. So if there's any sorts of differences in outcomes that we see, it's because there is some sort of social problem that established this inequality. And I think that was kind of like what I was meaning. Is like it's an imposed idea rather than a descriptive idea. Like we're going to believe and act as though people are blank slates at birth. And so any sorts of empirical data that we might see that there are inherent quality differences between people, well, that's just racist and sexist ideas that are still culturally inherited by us.
Well, yeah. All I can say in that regard is that yes, there is a value judgment in place. One of the reasons, like the root of the word diablo actually means to cut. Like a diabolical person is somebody who cuts and cuts and cuts and cuts and cuts and never stops cutting. Like the Christian notion that this was against creation, I think is quite telling, because but the value that the postmodernists ultimately value is that diabolical cutting. The thing that I find it was like, I think you were really getting to the nub of the issue there, John, because where you were speaking about equality of opportunity, the modernist position is equality. Sorry, the postmodernist or the social justice warrior position is equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, right? But if you what their position allows them to do with respect to the argument is that by claiming that everything is a social construction, they basically make society responsible for all of the inequality. Mm-hmm. This is tantamount.
That's like necessary in order to put forward these policies in order to correct it. Because if it was culturally due to cultural constraints or whatever, and these social constructions that led to this, then through those same means can we reverse these situations.
Right. The government is given unlimited authority, basically. Like if you see, the traditional notion of justice would be a notion of limited government. The way that I like to think of it is to say that We took our proclivity for violence and we bonded it to the letter of the law. And then the violence that was sanctified by the letter of the law, that was called justice, right? And so the government, for example, has a police force. It enforces the letter of the law. If you break the law, you go to the courts, you get judged, and then, well, okay, we don't really have the death penalty as much anymore, but presumably, okay, well, the death penalty is an example of state-sanctioned violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea is, though, or the more liberal idea is that the government's authority should be limited, so that it shouldn't have the arbitrary ability to engage in violence, right? So that the contrary point and this is what makes the social justice warriors so dangerous, and why I oppose them with everything that I have, is because they make the argument that the justice that has to be enforced is actually that the government mustn't just solve disputes that result as a result of violence, but actually it must impose violence in order to flatten the terrain. And that's an argument for unlimited government and an argument for unlimited violence. Like a notion of justice which makes violence, unlimited violence, tolerable is completely crazy as far as I'm concerned. It's like, why even have a society at that point?
Yeah.
I'll elaborate your point there with the fascism there, Trygve.
Well, what is fascism? It is roughly the idea that the state is omnipotent, basically can do whatever it wants. So giving the state unlimited authority to do whatever they want is basically textbook fascism, and that is what the postmodernists preach through the social justice activism, as Struan just went into.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's just fascism, because I mean communism made exactly the same move with respect to state authority. So
but we could argue, isn't communism a kind of fascism?
Yeah, but I mean, at this point, like, okay, if communism is fascism, then like the descriptive value of fascism as fascism loses its value in historical terms.
Except really, we're talking about socialism when we say communism, because communism is the idea of communism is to be post-state. It is the same kind of utopia that postmodernism envisions after they've taken care of all the inequities. Whereas socialism is more equivalent to the thing they try to do to deal with it.
You can choose to define words that way, but I find that the meaning of what fascist actually entails then loses a lot of its historical meaning. Let's say, like you're basically saying that like you're in an important way blurring the distinction between right wing and left wing politics, and I don't think that's necessarily wise.
Yeah,
especially. I think fascism is more of a psychological thing.
Well, wouldn't that be just sort of like authoritarian then? That seems more like politically neutral. Or
I mean, yeah, exactly. Like it is authoritarianism that we're talking about. To say
because,
that,
like, well, yeah, just because like within historically speaking and even like currently, there is a group that was known as the Antifascista. Which, I mean, they still exhibit certain authoritarian tendencies, but at least within their name, and their goal set and their practice, they're going against fascists. Right?
They go against everything they think is fascists, which includes a lot of non-fascists.
Exactly, yeah.
And they go against the fascist by fascist means.
Mm-hmm. Well, that I guess would be retributive justice in a sort of sense.
Repressive tolerance.
Yeah. So we've sort of gone into that. I always want to try and make things as practical as possible, which I know is going to be hard because this is sort of like a monster who's grown far outside of our capacities in order to be able to deal with. But I'd like to sort of at least sort of workshop some sort of ideas of like what is it that we can do, if anything, that can possibly help hold the wall, I guess, against the problems that are postmodernism, and maybe what are the ways in which to move forward from that. And
the first question I have for you is like, what are your opinions with respect to the values of modernism, let's say objectivity and so forth, because that will, I think, have the biggest influence on the way that you respond to postmodernism.
Right. And I should say, Ben has joined the call as well. Welcome, Ben.
Yeah, I was listening in. Thanks for letting me in again. But the one of the points to go back to the blank slate bit was there was also the discussion of logos. So like it was raised that, well, having logos as like our arbiter or our compass is the desirable state. But then one of the interesting things about the blank slate is it's promoted by highly intelligent people, like especially Silicon Valley, modern liberals, which are generally higher in openness, lean towards and lean heavily on the blank slate. And there is a correlation, it seems there, which is that the more that you can depend on your logos, so the more intelligent you are, the higher your ability to reinvent yourself with your intelligence, then the more you would project that onto other people. And the more you're also blindsided and taken for granted the other factors that contribute to your own development, with intelligence only being one of them. So there's a little bit there where perhaps the more intelligent you are, then the more you take for granted the other things that impact your own character and your own personality and your own outcomes, right? So when you're in Google or Facebook or whatever, you're just saying, oh, everyone has the same abilities because I have those abilities to reinvent myself. So everyone else should have that. And therefore, all the issues are actually due to discrimination.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I think that's very true, especially, the higher that somebody is in trait openness, the less doctrine and dogma they need in their life to get through the day. That's all, to me, from a personal experience point of view, that's almost incontrovertible.
Yeah, if we consider intelligence specifically as well, we might also point out a much more sinister reading, that it's people's wish to think that they got where they got solely due to their own hard work, which is reflected in thinking that everybody's a blank slate.
Right. Well, it's also interesting here, right? Because it also squarely puts the blank slate as a goal, like the Viveki self-transcendence quality that we should be striving for, we should be achieving, would kind of be the blank slate. So we're actually wanting to invent ourselves through our quest along life to become a blank slate. To some extent, maybe that's what the monks are also trying to do. So that's kind of interesting, where it's like this goal, but at the same time, it does blindside the other contributing factors.
Yeah.
All right. So Struan,
that's all I wanted to add. I'm going to pop out again. All right.
Okay.
Good point.
Guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Bye. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So Struan, your sort of question boiled down to sort of like, is modernism worth trying to fight for and worth saving? Or is it the fact that postmodernism's criticisms of it are lethal to modernism, and so there needs to be some other flag in which we need to be working towards besides returning back to modernism?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think, and that's why I'm very curious. What do you feel with respect to modernism?
Which
I
modernism?
myself, I'm a traditionalist, so my hopes are to sort of go even further back before modernism, to back when we had feudalism and the church instituting all laws and political systems, and that way you have one single coherent framework. I don't think that's really that feasible, so I'll have to take, I guess, some sort of secondary position of recognizing that I think postmodernism has a great deal of power in that it's able to establish technological superiority as well as institutional power in being able to establish borders and police and many different things without having to worry about having so like the benefits of modernism and secularity for the state is the fact that you can have you can have institutions that don't rely upon specific religious worldviews, and I'm using religious in a broader sense, that of just like value laden story frameworks that you live within. within modernism and secularism, so maybe I'm looking at a more specific subcomponent of modernism. You can have these institutions that don't have to rely upon that more meaningful, more meaning laden systems of living. And that's the thing. I think without the that's Marx's critique of capitalism is quite apt in that sense, that if capitalism is your God that you're living by, this is it's not impractical, but it's just not the way that humans derive happiness. So there has to be something more conducive, I think.
Yeah, well, you've given me a lot there.
Yeah. Sorry.
I would say that the secularism and modernism connection, I think, is actually fairly sound. The reason for that is that because I see that secularism in particular that arose in the West, but it arose it really got going once. It was after the Protestant movement, right? So you had the Protestants, the Catholics fighting each other. And then secularism was the way that they decided, okay, we're not going to fight about our values anymore because we're all Christian. We're just going to leave it implicit and unstated. And from that position on, then people didn't fight over values anymore. They just fought over the facts. And the fact of the matter was that they were willing to settle their fights using facts because they implicitly assumed that everybody had common values. And this was the understanding that worked until postmodernism came along and said, hey, hang on, you guys are actually, the values aren't anywhere near as ubiquitous as you guys think.
And that's the facts situation. Are multiply interpretable. So you can
depending upon which values, which hierarchy of values you use, exactly. Yeah. So this is the postmodernism critique that kills modernism. I don't think modernism is going to come back from it because, the move towards objectivity, the more scientific and the more objective we become, the more we realize there's no value here. We're the ones that are adding the value here. Modernism, I don't think, has any kind of response to that particular problem. It can't solve the value issue in objective terms. So the question then is, well, how do we actually reconstruct a discussion about value in such a way that it doesn't inevitably devolve into violence and that actually has people be articulating what their values are in good faith?
Well, you asked earlier about this thing about whether we should be defending modernism, whether it was worth defending, and you bring up one point here. But I would like to say which modernism one more time, because I don't think it's fair to equivocate the different things that have been labeled modernism. Take science. Science is a self-correcting system. The whole idea is to get closer and closer to truth. And sure, the truth is objective. It is not value-laden, except of course that we care about it because we don't want to crash with it. So in that regard, science is a very, very separate beast from something like Christianity or something like capitalism,
right,
or something like secularism or liberalism or what have you.
But you're not suggesting that science is a worldview, are you? You're not suggesting that we live according to science, are you?
The postmodernists are.
Okay, but I don't equate modernism with science, right? So when I'm talking about modernism, I'm not talking about, I understand that the scientific method might have been.
Sure. So I say which modernism, you say not that one. Okay.
Yeah, I think Trygve's point though is that when we say is modernism worth saving, there are multiple things that would be explicitly modernist, but are not necessarily inherently linked to each other. So capitalism is a modernist enterprise. Science is a modernist enterprise. And these are both modernist enterprises that they can work together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're fully compatible, I guess. I don't know.
They have to?
Yeah, and whether they even have to, is...
Right, so then the question is, okay, so if we've, I've got no qualms against discussing, even if, let's say, modernism is fatally flawed, that doesn't mean that we're going to throw everything with respect to modernism away, right? We're still going to, the idea would be how much of the remnants of modernism is still useful to us and how much of it can we recover? That's what I would automatically think.
Sure.
Even though I'm very opposed to postmodernism in many respects, I don't deny that in some ways it does actually have something valuable to contribute. And I wouldn't, like, I have no problem with the parts that are useful and, taking those parts that are useful and incorporating it into the way that I look at the world.
Right. And
so I would,
that's the thing. We've been sort of like publicly decrying postmodernism. I think looking at postmodernism with its historical context can really help us to appreciate it. In that, like, you have the sort of scientific method of phrenology that's trying to establish, we have a scientific basis for racism now and for treating Black people as inferior to us. And postmodernists were the exact people who were like, hold on, the way that you're establishing these facts is very much you have your own inherent idea of like what it means to be a good person, and then you're looking outwards and saying, this Black person doesn't cohere with my standard, therefore this Black person is inferior to me on an objective sense. And so there's a lot of projecting that's being done by the modernists in order to establish their own previous worldview. And that's like a way in which postmodernism is
it's a helpful tool.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, except it's only helpful within the frame of modernism, because if we go outside of that frame, there is no such thing as truth, and so there's no reason to care if they say something like X race is superior because why?
Right.
So I'm not.
Okay, so that's a really good.
Can we clarify that, please? I just want to ask, when you say that there's no truth outside modernism, do you mean according to the postmodernists, or do you mean in general?
According to postmodernists, the idea of truth and truth as something to be pursued is fundamentally regarded as a modernist idea by postmodernists.
Well,
and they would also classify things like Christianity and those traditions as modernists.
Well, okay, but then so is modernism 2,000 years old? Because that's how old Christianity is. Like, what do you mean by modernism?
Modernist or pre-modern. You might say two kinds of Christianity there, depending on how optimistic they are. But the idea of truth as something to be pursued that we can get closer to, that is a modern idea. And so there is no difference between how close we are to truth with one of those claims and one of the other, and the other one, if you don't have this kind of modern idea.
I don't know the postmodernists who actually claim that, and as far as I can tell, there's a clear historical lineage there. The notion of truth and reality and logos being basically one and the same concept and functioning exactly the same way. I mean, that idea is like at least 3,000 years old. I dispute the idea that modernism somehow has a privileged position on truth.
Then you have a problem with postmodernists. But the thing is that
which postmodernists say this? But which postmodernists say that? That's what I'm not clear on. I've never heard this before.
Well, here's one, Robin DiAngelo.
Okay, so she says that the pursuit for truth is
following Foucault, following lots of other people. You can even see this kind of thing in Nietzsche.
That truth is a modernist conception that doesn't actually exist. Is that sort of?
I don't think Nietzsche would use those terms, but you can see it start there when he talks about how there's no truth, only power.
Yes, but he traces the development back thousands of years between the master and the slave morality. So and he basically accuses the Jews of inventing the slave morality. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Nietzsche's view on truth is definitely older than modernism. That's all I can say.
But the age doesn't matter as insofar as it is a modernist idea, because modernism is the thing that postmodernism opposes, and modernism is the idea, you might say, that it is possible to progress.
Well, wouldn't that be a postmodernist idea as well? Isn't that sort of like it within the progressive movement?
That's why it's nonsensical. It's postmodern and neo-Marxism for a reason.
I don't know. I don't know if I quite buy that. We got a comment from Nick. Well, when we introduced pragmatism to de-equivalize, made that word up, and that again asks us the question to how to select the goal to judge our pragmatism against. Yeah, that's kind of the thing. I think that like Peterson tries to use pragmatism as sort of the promised land out of postmodernism while still retaining some aspects of modernism. But
Yeah,
it
but
still falls short in that, like, you have to first impose, okay, what are we trying to what utility are we trying to maximize here? And then from there we
yeah,
can establish
and
what
Peterson,
works.
unfortunately, in this regard, is unhelpful because he ultimately appeals to the truth, and so that's like the Viveki that criticizes Peterson and says, well, actually, pragmatism, they correctly made the distinction between truth and relevance, and in that regard, I actually think I follow Viveki. I don't think that I follow him with respect to what that means about truth, but
Do you mean
nevertheless,
like he follows, like he holds to modernist conceptions of truth because it is pragmatically useful, or are you meaning something
no,
else?
he like Peterson has. You can check on his channel. There's like a 2-minute animated clip where he basically tells the story, like it's the Genesis creation story, because every time God does something, afterwards he sees, and it was good. And so Peterson argues, if you confront the I can't remember exactly what he says, like the combinatorial explosiveness of the world using truth, what you get out of it, is good. And that's his basically his whole proposition. So the value, the truth and the goodness are like linked at the hip as far as Peterson is concerned.
Right, but it's a different sort of conception of truth because, like, I mean, that's the whole like Sam Harris debate that he had. It is certainly logos inspired that, like,
Well,
the
yeah,
truth
this
that
is
one
the notion.
believes, the
Yeah,
sort of free speech. I might not know this thing, but I ought to speak and live and die according to this belief because that is only a way in which progress can, or in which truth can be known.
It's a
well,
definition.
I would say that Peterson is using the notion of truth as in the arrow flies true.
Right. Yeah. Which is different from the modernist conception, though.
It's less propositional.
Right.
I will grant that much at least.
Well, wait. Propositional would be the modernist sort of.
Yeah, I'm saying the notion that the arrow flies true is less propositional.
Right. Okay. And then Nick also says, historically, really have to remember it largely, referring to postmodernism, starts as a literary criticism, and that is likely coming from the extreme prevalence of intentional use of propaganda through the 20th century. That's an interesting point because, like, during that time period, well, actually, no, sorry. I was thinking of like the boom from the printing press and how it's this new technology that can kind of like spread ideas outwards, even surpassing our ability to sort of like deal with these types of ideas, which can be.
I don't know. That's actually
kind of leads to book burning as the only way. But that's the thing with. I think there's actually something Paul Vanderklay brought up that, like, once you have the printing press, book burnings is just no longer efficient. It's not even an effective tool to sort of systematize thought because you can just print books faster than you can burn them. And so it's like we have to establish some new way of actually dealing with foreign ideas. And I guess you could just resolve to violence. I guess that's one way of doing it. But
yeah, well, it is. Christianity had its universalism, I suppose, in this regard was like it was a historical niche, because it's never going to be possible for anybody to unilaterally impose a particular dogma or interpretation ever again. So like that and before Christianity arose, most of the religious views that people had, it was a plurality. There wasn't any one particular dogma that everybody had to subscribe to. It's only after the advent of Christianity where the Romans found Christianity to be religious or to be politically useful that they started shutting down, for instance, the Neoplatonic schools and all of the competing schools of philosophical thought. And so that particular move, the printing press completely negates the viability of that ever happening again, I would say.
I'm not sure I quite fully understand that.
Well, okay, so if you're a Roman, right, and you're so what was it? I forget the first pope, the Council of Nicaea, Constantine. There we go.
Yeah.
Right. So right at the end of his life, he retired as emperor and became pope. But while he was emperor, right, he had basically total control over the Roman Empire. So you can start ordering schools to shut down, to stop teaching their stuff. If they've got objectionable material, you can burn it, you get rid of it. Yeah. You basically kill everybody who has an opposing view. and because he was emperor, he could basically enforce that. And so, like the Chinese emperors, a couple of them did the same thing because they wanted to be the first emperor in history. So, burn everything.
That's an interesting kind of point, and it's similar to, I guess, what Kierkegaard makes, is when the very nation that you live within becomes Christian, what does it even mean to be Christian anymore? Because there's no longer, like, okay, everybody's Christian now, but Christianity,
that's
like, what do you do from there?
Right. That's one of the problems that we're facing in terms of postmodernism, is precisely because we were, our cultural environment was so ubiquitously Christian that we forgot that there could even be anything else. Like that's one of Nietzsche's famous passages.
And that's the thing. Even those that respond against Christianity do so in a Christian manner. Like the reason that Christianity is immoral is because it oppresses gay people. And we're supposed to bring in the gay people within our broader community, which is a very Christian idea, which, of course, secular humanism is sort of a outgrowth of Christianity in a sense. And so, like, people...
absolutely.
Not all criticisms are like that, but a lot of them are.
Well, at least within Western criticisms of Christianity, it seems very much sort of still based within sort of the values of Christianity.
Yeah, I'll say it seems like most of the, shall we say, easier criticisms are like that, but the more complex ones, like God's problem, which is the problem of evil, they are a bit more rare, but they're also not on the same scale.
Well, that's the funny thing, is the problem of evil is based upon this idea that God is all loving and all caring, which is certainly a sort of foreign idea if, like, the world revolves off of power. And so, like, that God being all loving seems like, at least within sort of the more classical pagan understandings, to be something like, well, why the hell would God be all loving? He's the king. Why does he need to love the poor and the needy? That doesn't make any sense. But the problem of evil has certainly a Christian root, I think, at least, in that we're expecting God to be...
It's based on Christianity because it challenges Christian tenets about what God is. Yeah. It only works against things that agree with Christianity about those three things: omnipotence, omniscience, and what do you call it? Being all loving.
Omnipotence. Omnibenevolence. This is something it's a thought I've had at the beginning of this year, go ahead.
I would dispute. I don't think the problem of evil is criticizes Christian values. It doesn't.
No. It's relying upon Christian values, and then when you look out into the world,
right? But what you were talking about is people criticizing Christianity using Christian values. Like this is. But what I'm saying is
it's not like that. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah. That's what my.
What I'm saying is that the reason that the problem of evil is not like that is because it doesn't actually criticize Christian values at all.
Exactly. It's completely irrelevant to the values.
Right. Okay. So I was saying that the criticisms of Christianity are coming from within the Christian values. So, like, the reason that Christianity is wrong from a sort of secular humanist perspective is because you're oppressing gay people and minorities to live out their full autonomy to who they flourish to be, who they're truly supposed to be. So that's utilizing a Christian value that all people have a universal moral value, and then pointing out how this institutional structure of Christianity, based within this archaic Jewish religion, is marginalizing some people. And so that's that understanding. In the same way, the problem of evil has this understanding that, okay, to be an omnibenevolent character, you would not allow suffering to occur, just because that's something that is not conducive to that person's flourishing. And so
if you're also omnipotent, it just doesn't make sense. There's no need to make it like that, because you can make it whatever way you want.
Yeah.
You can make it so you don't need to go through suffering to become the best you could be.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is the problem of evil doesn't say there's anything wrong with Christian values.
Correct.
Right. Yeah.
But therefore,
which is why it's unfair by you, John Buck, to put it on the same page as those that are directly based on Christian values, because this one just takes Christian premises and says these premises can't be true at the same time.
Well, that's what I was saying.
No, but that's why I disagree, because what I'm saying is that the problem of evil doesn't satisfy John's criteria. He was never talking about the problem of evil. You're saying that it doesn't apply, but exactly. I don't think he ever intended it to apply.
The reason I say it doesn't apply is because it's an example of a more sophisticated criticism than those that are just based on values.
But it's not a criticism. That's what we're saying. It doesn't criticize Christian values.
Not of values, but of Christianity.
I've never said that these are criticisms of Christian values. It's criticisms of Christian practice. And the problem of evil, it's not a criticism of Christian practice.
But of Christianity as such.
But of the world that we exist within. Like, given this worldview of Christianity and this character of who we would expect the almighty ruler of the universe to be, the world does not match with that idea that we have of him. It's like, there's a tweet that I had from earlier this year, and I still think back on it, that we've evolved a cultural morality that has progressed to the point that we would no longer think a being who created our world to be of that moral character. And it's such a weird sort of idea that, like, our morality or our conceptions of what we would believe to be moral or immoral have surpassed the thing which itself actually gives us existence, and using gives us existence in, I guess, a metaphorical sense, if you want, because like whether or not God actually exists, we do exist, and there was a thing that brought our existence about. And now we've come to this point where the fact that we have been brought to exist within this type of world indicates the immoral character of whatever thing brought us into this world.
Or shall I say the arbitrary, amoral, perhaps?
I don't know. It seems almost like the problem of evil actually produces an malevolent character. I mean, yeah, sure. I guess that's a way in which, like, deism can sort of like be a proper solution to the problem of evil, and that, I don't know. I think we've even come to the point that doing nothing expresses a poor moral character on your part. So, like, the fact that, sure.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people think that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to move exactly from there, but yeah.
No,
maybe.
but okay. So you said something about Christian values, correct? That most Christians of Christianity operate from the Christian values and try to turn those on Christianity.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I said in response to that was that yeah, that's the easy criticisms, the ones that aren't very sophisticated. But you also have the deeper ones that go against Christianity based on something like this logical paradox. Because if you consider what you could do if you're omnipotent, you could do literally whatever you want to do, right? So there's nothing that prevents you, nothing whatsoever that prevents you from making it so that suffering, for example, is completely unnecessary, completely, absolutely unnecessary for any kind of growth whatsoever. It doesn't even need to exist. If you have something omnipotent. So therefore we have to conclude that it's either omnipotent or all loving.
Yeah, but you're not questioning the fact that the suffering is wrong. Like, that's the Christian perspective, is that the suffering is wrong. You're assuming the Christian lens in order to criticize the Christian lens. That's what John was saying.
I think he's bringing like, there's a way in which you can still have Christianity and adopt, like, the progressive sort of values of, like, okay, we got to bring in the LGBT community into this system.
What I'm saying
like,
is,
you can still have Christianity there, but with the problem of evil, that's a self-destructive criticism that if it is true, then Christianity itself fails.
Yeah,
right. But
just like
the point is that the Christianity's truth or falseness has nothing to do with the values that Christianity has adopted. If people are criticizing Christian values, using Christian values, they don't have any other thing else other than Christianity to rely upon. Therefore, it's self-refuting. To say that, okay, I'm criticizing Christianity in terms of the problem of evil, therefore it's false, is fine, but that doesn't actually give you an alternative value system.
The postmodern
Except suffering is supposed to by basically every system you can think of, including Buddhism, Hinduism. Nobody wants suffering. It's not exclusive to Christianity, so you can't say that that's a unique Christian value and therefore self-refuting.
Well, and I'll also push back in saying that like you can have Christian values just while rejecting Christian ontology. I'm saying that somewhat cheekily because I don't actually think that's true, at least not in a lasting sort of sense.
Well,
but
the issue is, it's not obvious why the suffering is wrong.
I mean, it is sort of obvious. Like when you experience suffering or when you observe other people suffering, it's an immediate response to you that
but maybe wrong. I like the fact that you're suffering. Why is that wrong?
Well, you do, but you haven't been raised in the Christian culture. Like if you've
no, but that's what I'm saying. So you've rejected the Christianity. Okay, so why is suffering wrong? Somebody answer me. That's what I'm saying. There's no answer to that question if you're not using Christianity. If there's alternatives, fair enough, but let's hear them.
You have the Christian values, but you reject the Christian ontology. And so using the Christian values, you can still establish that suffering is wrong for all people everywhere, but you don't have you don't have the means of the you don't have the ontology that provides the means in which to do something about that suffering. I think.
Well, that's a different discussion. I was trying to speak to. Sorry, I don't know if I'll pronounce this correctly. Trygve, his point anyway. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So something going back to the modernism, postmodernism sort of dialectic that's going on. Something very interesting. Huh?
I posted a comment because I figured it was a bit too tight in discussion. So an alternative to Christian rejection of suffering.
Suffering is what Buddhism seeks to avoid by reaching nirvana.
Is Buddhism Christian? If not, then it's not uniquely Christian. Therefore, that point doesn't apply to the criticism.
No, but if you're not going to argue the Christian, if you're not going to argue the Christian reason for why suffering is wrong, you have to present me in with another reason. So, are you saying Christianity is wrong because Buddhism is right, or what is your foundation for claiming that suffering is wrong? That's my question.
Struan's like going full presuppositionalist argument tactics over here.
Yeah, and the answer would be, I don't know very many people who would want to suffer, because suffering is, I would say, you could basically define it as something you don't want to experience.
Yeah, it's self-evident.
Fair enough, but there. Okay, so you're making a description about the values that people have. That's not actually taking a position on whether or not those values are valid or not.
Well, if I say I agree with them, then it's valid, right?
If all opinions are valid, sure.
Well, that is sort of the postmodernist.
How about an opinion that nobody disputes?
But I'm disputing the value right now.
Okay, so are you disputing that I don't want to suffer? Are you disputing that you don't want to suffer?
No. As I use a hypothetical example, it's like, okay, so John Buck doesn't want to suffer, but maybe I enjoy seeing John Buck suffer. So
I like
that makes it
but
great.
That's not you. So, that's not you. We're talking about the person himself.
But why should I care about his suffering?
Right.
Yeah. Okay,
why is it not only my suffering that I care about?
Autonomy. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. There you go.
Well, that's a modernist conception, though.
Yeah, right? that assumes that I'm obligated. I have an obligation towards.
I don't know
truth.
If it works under postmodernism.
I don't know if an obligation towards truth gets me.
Yeah, that's true. Kant's categorical imperative relies upon human capability for reasoning, and so if postmodernism is true and all reasoning is just an expression of willpower, then I don't know if that works as a justification under postmodernism.
Under postmodernism, no. But why would we assume that? Why would we assume that people aren't capable of reasoning? I don't know anyone who isn't capable of reasoning on some level.
The question is, why would we presume that our values are subordinate to our reasoning processes?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
The answer, I guess, is why wouldn't we?
Oh, well,
because people act irrationally.
You can arbitrarily choose to value your reason above your values in general, but that's not a decision that you can justify in terms of reason.
So let's tie to something broader, eh? So we can either assume that the world is made up of things that tie together in some ways, that things are relative to each other and relate in different ways, that one event affects another that happens later, and so on. Or we can assume that that's not the case. So this is basically Pascal's wager. If the first case is true, then reasoning is our best bet at approaching it. because reasoning attempts to make a coherent case, make a coherent explanation of something. If this is not the case, then you have no case to make any difference, because you can't rely on reason to get there. Meanwhile,
right. So
if you assume the opposite, you don't get anywhere.
yeah, but like,
well, if you, maybe
all
if the
past
opposite
evidence-
is, yeah, sorry,
all
go
past
ahead.
evidence of people trying to settle disputes of value using reason have turned out to be horrible disasters. It's never seemed to have worked even once. So I don't think, like, just assuming that reason
an
doesn't work
example?
in this case seems to me to be the least effortful assumption.
It's not to say that reason should always be relied upon. It's to say that reason is a good baseline, that it's a reasonable thing to assume that people are capable of reasoning enough to agree on anything. Not everything, but anything, potentially. We don't know until we try,
Yeah.
and it's possible, always possible, to say that when we haven't gotten there yet, it's because we haven't gotten there yet.
Right, but that's a belief that ultimately that the truth is salvation.
Sure.
I'm
Is
not
that
sure I'm
exclusively
inclined.
Christian?
No, well, that's what I say. This is thousands of years old. I'm not
Yeah.
sure I believe that necessarily. Like, I've got nothing against truth, but I don't think that truth and goodness are synonymous. And I think that it's important to make that distinction. I tend to think that the truth is more or less decided in terms of facts, and goodness is decided more or less in terms of value. And those two domains, there's some overlap, but you can't derive the one from the other. I don't think. I think the attempt to unify everything basically results in disaster every single time it's tried.
I mean, we talked a little bit about this in my reading of the epistemology paper, that, like, in order to have some sort of justified true belief, you have to have justification, and justification is inherently a normative position, which is relying upon axiology of, like, what is good. And so that's at least a way I see in which truth can be downstream from goodness.
But hang on. The justification for the true belief is the justification that proves the truth, not the goodness.
Right. Right. And maybe I'm
not saying
speaking. It's not truth that's based upon normativity. Well, I did say that, but I'm saying instead facts are based upon normativity, because, like, there might be some truth, but once you have a fact, that's something I actually have, and that I believe to be true based upon some sort of system of justification.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I don't know if your point is
well,
like you're addressing something like parallel to what I was trying to talk about.
Well, I was just at least giving a little bit of the opportunity to see the connection there between goodness and truth.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, like the justification thing doesn't get you to goodness. It gets you to truth. I don't dispute the notion that you can have justification for goodness, as opposed. But
I'm saying in order to have justification, you have to have some sort of system of goodness, or some sort of.
No, but that's what I dispute. Don't you just need a system of truth? Because the system of truth will provide you with a justification for the justified true belief. That it's true doesn't necessarily mean it's good.
That's a definitional case, though. So, for example, in Christianity, they would posit that truth and goodness are deeply related, and that if you follow the truth, what comes out is good, and vice versa. If it's good, then it came from the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Okay. So just one example that I can use is, like, okay, if you read something in a magazine, then it's less likely to be true than if you read something from, I don't know, Wikipedia or some actual encyclopedia, something that has been peer reviewed. That's like that's a difference in value between these two sorts of methods, and that's a way in which I see there's
I think
relying upon goodness.
I think we're equivocating, because, like, the idea, like, I can talk about what makes a good murderer. If I can reliably slash for your throat and hit my mark, then I'm a good murderer. But that doesn't mean that I'm good.
I see.
And, like, we're trying to get at different meanings of good here.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. That, like, if your value is truth, then there are certain efficient means to get to there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that's true is going to be good for us. Like it could very well be the
Right.
case that there are certain truths that are actually bad for us. In fact, bad for society in order if they knew it.
Right, and arguably,
Statistics, perhaps, or
arguably,
something.
the fact that there is no God is exactly such a truth.
Ah, yes.
And so that you see, like this is where the modernism truth thing really starts to bite, because what exactly do you, sorry?
No, that's a really interesting key. Like if postmodernism is sort of the salvation from the fact that there is no God, because like if modernism is true, the fact that there is no God, that entails like anything is permissible. But if the truth that there is no God is no longer necessary or even relevant to us, then we can continue on as if there is some sort of system of morals and like what we ought to be doing and things like that, without having to rely upon the ontology of there being some sort of benevolent creator and sustainer of the universe.
Exactly, now you're getting it.
Okay.
Because how do we talk about virtues and what is good and all of these things without using the historical baggage that we've been saddled with that ended up in failure where we could no longer believe in it?
So yeah, I guess the key question for postmodernism is whether you can have a axiology minus an ontology. And
yeah, I like that.
I mean, it's possible because we've been like relying upon it for quite a while, and especially if it is the case that there is no God. Functionally speaking, you can have an axiology of as if there was a God when there actually wasn't. It's just if everybody believes that there is a God, you can still work off of it. What is it?
Right.
The panopticon within, like if you believe there is somebody watching in the sky over all your actions, that's going to be a sufficient means for getting you to behave properly, even if there is no such actual person watching you there. Just the idea that you're being watched is enough to constrain your behaviors.
Right. Doesn't need to be watched all the time. Just the idea that you might be watched right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
With the panopticon idea, it's like this prison system that is pretty much open face, but or I don't know. Within each cell, there's like this small hole where there is supposedly some sort of watchman that's at any point could be looking through your cell to see what you're doing.
I got that. I just didn't hear what.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what Trygve was saying. Is that
basically just a restatement of that?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, no, fair enough. I agree with that very much. I don't know, like, I think you would have to have, like, there would have to be a paradigm shift with respect to how you view truth, as in it could no longer be the ultimate value. It would just have to be one of many values. If you're operating from that perspective, then I think you could plausibly entertain the notion of a God that watches you in such a way that it affects your behavior, despite you not necessarily believing in the literal truth of it.
Right. And I think that's
whether that's viable
one...
or not, I don't know. But I definitely agree with you with sorry, I just wanted to say the splitting of the axiology and the ontology. One of the things that in like tracking the etymology of all of these words that really struck me was that sooth, as in soothsayer, and ontos, the Greek word for being, they're actually cognates, and they both basically originate with the idea of truth. Like
what's a cognate? Truth, like they're just related.
It means like basically they have a common ancestor.
Okay.
A word, so they trace back. So the roots ontos and sooth is ultimately like true, real, those notions. But the point is that once you start making those connections, you start to very quickly realize that people held truth and reality and goodness as like one. And that was the way, like Zoroastrianism. There was a whole long conversation between Alexander Bard and John Vervaeke, which you might want to check out because if you're interested in this. But they really track the way that like the words were transformed, because Bard basically argues that Zoroastrianism comes from 1700 AD. 1700 BC. So it's like it's a good millennium before the Axial Age. But then the point is that you can see, you can trace how Zoroastrian thinking as a cultural cognitive grammar actually informed subsequent movements such as Christianity, by virtue of the fact that their grammar system was incorporated. And the thing is that Zoroastrianism actually split the world into two, between Asha and Druj, and then the Asha was truth and the Druj was deceit. And so going back all the way into Proto-Indo-European, you can see this common tendency of the Proto-Indo-Europeans to make the distinction between truth and falseness, and for that to be their axiology. And so the postmodernism would be splitting would be creating a new axis somehow. And so I very much agree with you on that point. Like that's right where we want to be thinking going forward.
And I think the postmodern problem is that in order to communicate ideas with other people, you're having to assume some sort of ontology. And so it's
some sort of truth.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you can put forth, maybe I guess you could theoretically have a system of stories that you don't believe to be ontically true, but still believe them due to, I guess, their practical or maybe their aesthetic value.
I would say that the postmodern criticism fundamentally is it's not a criticism of truth as such. And the issue was that we held truth to be absolute, and that we held that we had access to this absolute truth.
Right.
That fails. Like you can demonstrate is like there's always some measure of relativity that creeps into the door, like unavoidably. But if you don't expect that your truth has to be connected to the absolute, like it has to be correspond towards reality in order to or quote unquote reality, let's say objective reality, in order to be valid, then you can have a more limited or relative truth, and that you can work with.
And that's actually where the criticism from postmodernism towards science falls apart, because it assumed that all science was positivism, which it isn't.
Well, that's debatable.
I mean,
there is like science. There is a thing called scientism. Logical positivism was a movement that basically wedded itself towards
so logical positivism and science. There's
logical positivism is basically scientism. But
logical positivism is also explicitly not declaring any sort of metaphysics or ontology, but rather just a description of what we observe empirically.
Right, but logical positivism explicitly argued against metaphysics as a valid discipline, right? So but your ontology is in some sense contingent upon your metaphysics. Like there was a gap there, and that's what the postmodernists. Well, it wasn't actually postmodernist, but it's a weakness that the postmodernists can very easily exploit. Logical positivism was refuted basically by
itself, actually.
by Quine. I forget his first names, but he wrote the Two Dogmas of Empiricism and basically killed that essay just killed logical positivism dead, because their definition of meaning was meaningless fundamentally. So hard refute. But the point is
that's the modernism, at least within that
modernism from a logical positivist perspective, at least. But ultimately the death of logical positivism, and I would say Gödel's incompleteness theorems, modernism can't recover from those. The postmodernists are kind of besides the point at this point. But what I wanted to say, was that the postmodernists are very good at exploiting the logical positivists insofar as they appeal to empirical observation, because the appeal to empirical observation cannot itself be grounded in empirical observation.
That's a really interesting connection between the refutation of logical positivism and Gödel's theorem. And Nick also in the chat is bringing up Kant. But it's really interesting that because that's Wittgenstein's sort of response to Kant is if you're saying that there's some portion of reality that cannot be known by us, you would first have to know all of reality and what portions can and cannot be known by those within reality in order to say that there is this whole subcategory or subdomain of reality that cannot be known. And so you're just
it's basically just the restatement of this. You can't prove a negative.
Well, I guess in a sort of sense.
Yes, and this is where it gets so interesting, because how do we actually have any kind of comprehension of negatives in the first place? It's like, how is that possible? If you really think about it, that will really start to mess with you.
If you just look at the basics, such as statements, there are no black swans. You can't prove that to be the case.
Right.
But you can prove the existence of black swans.
there's certain
Yes, but
negatives
the point is that, okay, so you can never prove a negative, but nevertheless,
but we still
you have to
it
work
in
with negatives
concession.
on a daily basis.
You can define them.
Yes, but
You
what I'm
can't
saying
say that
is
it's
that
not a swan if it's not black, not a swan if it's not white, for example.
Right. And that's just sort of like a priori establishing some sort of truth by just sort of marginal. That's kind of interesting. It's like once you're faced with some sort of exception to the rule, you just modify the rule so that that's no longer an exception. And that's sort of like the criticism that postmodernists were making against modernism, is that like, oh, your definitions that you're relying upon are just definitionally true and not actually telling you something about what reality is actually sort of like. All right, so before we sort of wrap things up, I do want to get back to like what can we practically bring from this? I know, Trygve, that you sort of have a bit of interaction with postmodernists online that you try to deal with. Is there anything from those experiences that you can, I don't know, share to?
Well, if I look not online, but in my own experience in academia, I've taken to something I like to call reconstruction, which is basically when something is deconstructed in class, and it seems to me that that it is deconstructed in a manner that doesn't actually make sense. It is actually very easy to make the case that it still works because the construction didn't actually hit anything critical. So I've taken to just pointing those out when I see
example?
them. If you look at culture, for example, what makes someone Norwegian is the case that we had in one class, because of course we're in Norway, and so we were presented with a stereotype, a picture that contained a lot of things that many people regard as typically Norwegian, and we're asked, are you Norwegian if you don't have all of these, and so on. And so what I pointed out was family resemblance, and with just those two words and what that means, you basically get the point. Okay, so it doesn't reflect any individual person, but that doesn't make it invalid. Like averages, because it still reflects something, even though it's nothing concrete. It reflects something people can see, like how people can see things in your face that give them an idea of who you're related to, depending on how well they know your family. The same kind of mechanism of pattern recognition still works, still hits something, and that hits something. It's just something.
Yeah.
So that would be one example of what I've been trying to do in trying to make it so that people who are exposed to these kinds of no position criticisms don't lose their own position.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not so sure how well you're bringing in racial realism is really going to work as sort of a response to postmodern. I'm just being facetious. It's not.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one. But I do think no. But there is the distinction between statistical averages and individual cases, and the fact that there isn't a direct correlation doesn't mean there is no connection.
Yeah.
And so like people are forced to always make decisions based upon low resolution models. That's unavoidable. The fact that people have to do this isn't actually a criticism against them. It's just an acknowledgement that they have to do this. And like postmodernism would basically use the recognition that people have to use low resolution models as an argument against any kind of truth formation whatsoever, because they would argue that it doesn't meet the criterion of objectivity that the modernists have set out. But you can
if we just lower our standards, right? If we lower our standards for what we're wanting to get out of the practice of science or rationality, so that it's no longer establishing the objective truth independent of any sort of experiencer, but rather what is the closest approximation of reality that we can utilize that from
the way that I would put it is like if you change, you say, instead of saying this is the case, you say I see this to be the case. So you put yourself back in the picture. You're making a statement about yourself, not necessarily about the world divorced from yourself.
It looks like
that qualifies the postmodernism. Like that's a way of getting around the postmodernism criticism, I would say, to a large degree.
Yeah, but at the same time, a lot of the time that can be inferred. You don't always need to say it outright, because quite frequently, when you write papers and so on, you have a word limit. And the thing about those is that if you have to fill them with a lot of clutter, there's less room for new points. So
Yeah,
the
but
more can
I'm
be
just
left
making.
without saying, the better. And
Yeah,
this just adds a lot of clutter.
What I'm saying is that I'm changing it from an objective to subjective framework. I'm not talking about what you actually say. I'm talking about the perspective that the argument is presented from. If it's subjective, then you see you're arguing what is true in terms of your lived experience. So long as you're being honest about your lived experience, that successfully establishes a data point that can be used in terms of communication. Whether or not it's objectively true becomes besides the point. You can use people's you can use a certain measure of trust in people's honesty to trust that they will report what they experience faithfully, and then you can see whether or not their observations are, let's say, consistent or inconsistent, to then update that trust. But that's a way, like if you do that, then science could still give empirical results. It doesn't necessarily appeal to objectivity in the same way that enables it to be deconstructed by the postmodernists.
The thing is, as far as I'm aware, it hasn't really appealed to objectivity in that regards in the last 50 years. It's more like it's been possible to read it that way if you wanted to. And postmodernists have done that because that gives them ammunition. But that it's possible to read it that way doesn't mean that it's meant that way. And that's something that the postmodernists basically just assume.
Well,
I
would say that the solution,
logical positivism with all of science.
Well, I mean, it depends about how would you define objectivity then? Like, let's just get that clear so that we can, so that I know that I'm not talking past you.
Okay, so objectivity is something like what we aspire to reach in a view that encompasses all the details of what is the case, without misunderstanding anything based on a false assumption. Now, there's a lot in that, but something like that.
Right. So I would say that particular version of objectivity is very vulnerable to postmodern criticism. So that's why I say don't even try.
Why? Because we aspire to it.
Yeah. So I say I don't think that claiming that that's what we're aspiring to is very helpful. I would rather say that we're aspiring. Like I would say I aspire not to understand everything, but to report my position honestly. Because I don't need to know everything in order to be honest with you. As long as my truth is honest, that should be sufficient.
Yeah, I also like honesty, and I think honesty is something that should always be maintained. But science tries to get as close to objectivity as possible all the time. Now that requires honesty because we need to make clear what we can't account for in the given case. But that doesn't mean we can't try to move in that direction, which is what science tries to do. And which is why I don't think it's fair to say that it's vulnerable unless you assume a lot of other things that aren't in it.
Yeah, I think you need to be very careful about the way that you say that you're going about objectivity, because it's going especially within the modernist frame, I don't see how you can make that kind of claim without presuming the kind of absolute truth that the postmodernists criticize, and that the Gödel's incompleteness theorem and so on and so forth.
Well, how about this? Pascal's wager once again. Either there is an absolute truth or there's not an absolute truth. We don't know. Either could be the case. We can't imagine the case that it's not the case. But if it was, then it would be nothing to aspire towards. Well, if there is a truth, we would probably come to lose something if we didn't try, at least, to move towards it. So it's kind of a question of where to hedge your bets.
Yeah, I mean, look, people can make the same argument for Pascal's wager in terms of theism. Either you believe that there's a creator after you die is going to look, at what you did during life, or you don't. And Pascal said, well, it's easier to believe that there is a God. I don't find those sorts of wagering bets very convincing either way, to be honest.
Well, I think Pascal's wager has definitely, it is a theistic argument. But I think there's ways in which it can be thought about purely secularly as well.
I'm saying the wager move. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. I don't find it convincing, and I was using the
no matter what you're talking about. Okay, so here's an example that I find particularly convincing is the dangers of artificial intelligence. If there's a 1% chance that the human race could go extinct through the creation of some sort of AGI that somehow manages to, what is it, the example, the paperclip maximizer or something akin to that, where like we put some sort of AGI in charge of cleaning up the environment or something like that, and it comes to the realization.
Yeah, hang on. But there's a vast difference between making a Pascal's wager in terms of what we shouldn't do and making a Pascal's wager in terms of what we should do. Like,
Okay,
yes, I'm
explain why.
100%. No, I'm 100% on board with you saying, okay, well, AI is dangerous. It could lead to consequences we cannot foresee, so therefore we should never open the door. That's vastly different from making a decision like, oh, okay, I'm going to act as if God exists, and all of my priorities in life are now arranged along that particular interpretation lens. It's not the same thing.
Any action is a non-action, and any non-action is an action. Like, if you're not going to do something, you're also doing something else.
Any difference is a sameness, and any sameness is also a difference.
I think you need to make the case for why you can make the case negatively but not positively, as you said.
Like, the
Explain
only way
why.
that you can perform a
Because
non-action is by not existing.
I'm not making a Pascal's wager in terms of how I should be proceeding. I'm saying I explicitly avoid, if I don't know what the consequences of a particular decision are and I can see that they are likely to be catastrophic, then don't make the decision. Like, the question of whether or not, I don't think I don't need to make a Pascal's wager in terms of whether or not AI is dangerous. I know that it's dangerous. Like, there's no
but
doubt in my
that's
mind.
what you said, right? You said that you could use Pascal's wager for things to not do, but you could not use it for things to do. So I would like to see you make that case.
Because it's a different kind. It's like proving a negative versus proving a positive. It's different. The rules are different. So in terms of the negative, what I'm saying is, like, you can't expect me to prove it. I'm willing to err on the side of caution. In terms of making a Pascal's wager and say, like, I should observe, I should act as if objectivity is true because there's no point in acting otherwise. That doesn't make sense to me.
All right, well, here's a positive example then. Climate change. If it's the case that there are these certain, like, highly risky behaviors that we're currently performing, and there's other things that we could be doing to sort of keep such negative consequences from occurring, do we opt to start doing those other things? Like, do we institute some sort of carbon tax? That's a positive action that we could take place based upon some sort of existential risk measurements that we're doing.
But you're like, okay, so here's what I would object is, like, okay, we can assume that Pascal's wager, but you haven't told me anything about what activities actually do help the climate. That's a big black box. Like, just because you say climate change is bad doesn't mean I necessarily know what to do about climate change.
True, but it might be through via negativa that we can recognize, okay, there's certain things that obviously can't be good for the climate, that we're like using aerosol cans or something like that. And so if there's something...
But that's the negative.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Dang it. You caught me.
Okay, so if you take the example I came with earlier again, this thing about there being an objective reality or there not being an objective reality. There's a black box there as well, sure. But what does it include? Well, it's not actually black. It includes things like take truth claims seriously.
I don't like the way that fundamentally that presumes that you have to assume that your perceptions of the world are accurate. That they
don't need to be accurate. They just that it's been not useless. And there's no reason to think they're useless.
That's not useless means some measure of accuracy. It means that that you can achieve truth by trusting your senses, and that you can have you see it. It's like as Nick was speaking about the whole Kantian thing. Like, Kant argued quite decisively, in my opinion, that you cannot have any understanding of the thing in itself divorced from your perspective on it. And the fact that you cannot have any, like, that's the post-modernism criticism of modernism.
And
because if you can't have access, like all of the traditional knowledge claims presume that you could have access to the thing in itself, that there was some kind of immediate, like, well, maybe immediate is too strong a word, but the mediation was veridical, it was true. If the second that you have an interpretation that actually interprets a data and the interpretation itself cannot be justified in terms of the data, then that kind of worms like that trust, you never recover it. And so, but what you can do is you can speak honestly about your experiences, because your experiences are after the interpretive mechanism. And so whatever you're reporting is faithful to that interpretive mechanism. And that's where you put your trust in, I would say. I think that gets around the postmodernism thing. I don't know if you can salvage objectivity as it has been understood, at least in terms of understanding the thing in itself.
See, the thing is, you don't need to think you have a full comprehension of anything. You just need to think you can have some comprehension of whatever you're talking about. Yeah, it doesn't need to be absolute to be taken seriously. It just needs to be a perspective, and yeah, that equalizes all perspectives. But then you can compare them.
Right, but this isn't. But you're not positing an
absolute. Yeah, no
truth
reason to take truth seriously if you don't assume that there is something they connect to, something they reflect. Not perfectly, not completely, but in some way.
Yeah, but earlier you were saying that you were speaking about like a Pascal's wager in terms of an absolute truth. Do you understand
that there exists one, not that we have complete access to it?
But if we never have access to this thing, then it's irrelevant to us.
We don't know the access doesn't mean that we don't have it.
But you're presuming in terms of objectivity. Objectivity presumes that you can have access to it. That's my point.
The aspiration to objectivity assumes that we have not zero contact with objective reality. And I would say we know this because we experience discomfort.
Well, I mean, that's certainly possibly the case. I've got nothing against the possibility, but again, that's not like in terms of speaking about what's defensible against postmodernism. I don't think that the objectivity thing is going to cut it at the end of the day. And well, as I say, the argument is fundamentally against the axis of the absolute, because if you cannot,
let's distinguish between hard and soft objectivity and hard and soft truth and hard and soft all these kinds of things. Hard, I agree. Soft, I disagree. And the soft would be that the axis is not zero and therefore worth considering. That truth claims have value. That trying to be objective has value, and so on. The soft one is not disputable based on the postmodern criticism, because that makes the postmodern criticism irrelevant.
But you recognize that you're making a value judgment and asserting it to be true, and that's not actually something that you're grounding in reason. That you're appealing to
Pascal's wager. I would say that's pretty reasonable.
Well, I don't. Is gambling reasonable then?
Yeah. Gambling when there's one win condition and 3 loss conditions and only 4 conditions. Yeah.
I didn't quite hear that. Sorry.
When you have 4 possible situations and only one of them is a win, then why not?
Yeah, but you're already using the value structure in order to make that determination as to what is a win. So in other words, you're begging the question in terms of the gamble.
Yeah, but would anyone disagree?
Well, okay, so is begging the question then, but like, you're basically making the argument that it's rational to beg the question.
For these kinds of things.
No,
I would argue that there is a bottom. That there's a bottom in all systems that we eventually get to. When we get there, we can't appeal to reason anymore besides betting. And Pascal's wager or something like it is what we resort to because we have nothing better.
Yeah, but fair enough. But then the point is, okay, so you bet your way, somebody else bets the other way. You know, one side can't criticize the other side just because they take the opposite side of a bet, is what I'm saying. Like the ability to reasonably determine between these positions becomes impossible.
Well, I would say that trying to reason implies that there's only one reasonable position.
That's
in this case.
That's the absolute.
It implies that there's only one reasonable position in terms of the bet. So say if I take one position in the Pascal's wager situation, and you take the other one, and you try to reason with me, you're implying that the reasons for picking the 2 sides are equal. And when you imply that, you're also implying that that since I have a reason for mine that says that there is no win on the other side, And you have a reason for yours that says...
This is I would say no, this is exactly where you fall. Like, you attempting to make that move is just going to make you fall prey to the postmodernist undermining your claims on the basis that you can't satisfy your own standards, without actually without introducing any of his own standards in the process. And so then you would turn around and say, well, there's no reason here, and the postmodernists would say, yeah, that's exactly right.
But that makes their system worthless.
In your view, perhaps they think it has value, but the thing is that you can't adjudicate between those two positions in terms of the objective truth.
Well, yeah, when it's easier to undermine theirs, I would think that makes one of them much easier to defend.
Well, I don't know if that's the thing. Like, since they don't have a system, all they have is a deconstruction method, and so
they have the no position.
Yeah, so how do you deconstruct the no
you
position
have implicit,
position?
you have implicit positions.
Yeah.
Can you guys?
The thing is, what I'm saying is,
okay. Sorry, Nick. Like, I wanted to invite. I should have invited you earlier since you were interacting with chat, but I didn't think to it. And now we've been like just stepping over each other and like while you're trying to say something. Sorry.
My green light isn't turning on. That was what made me skeptical. I'm used to trying to force my way in. There's a lot of assumption here in that when we take Pascal's wager back to the level of being a person, I don't think it's actually a fair assessment to say only one wins, in the sense that if one throws out reason in this case, they may open up the satisfaction of their desires that were not within the pursuit of truth.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that the postmodernist would say, well, here are my values. I've arbitrarily selected them. You know, go sit in a volcano and rotate if you don't like it. Oops.
And I'm going to use power to exert them over you because there's nothing else.
Well, I mean, from a factual standpoint, all activity occurs in terms of power.
Depends on how you define power.
I beg pardon?
Depends on how you define power.
Well, I would say, okay, so power is the expression of energy, let's say. Is that a fair definition?
Yeah, sure.
So I've no like, in terms of the way that the postmodernists argue for the quote unquote rightness of power, it seems unavoidable that, I mean, wherever the greatest force is, that's the way that the thing is going to go. Like, it's always energy, energy inequalities yielding action from a thermodynamic perspective. So, like, I don't know. I would say, in terms of truth, the postmodernist claim to power is a pretty strong one, actually.
It's probably easy to think of it in Nietzsche's terms, with will to power, where you basically have this idea that everything that exists has its will to power that it exerts on everything around it to shape it to fit with how it is. Well, and bigger objects have the accumulated will to power that is expressed through the bigger units. So, for example, a person.
Yeah. It almost seems like Nietzsche's relying, in some sense, or at least in this form of argument, that which is unreasonable is what is true. And that throws a pretty detrimental paradox right into the center of a Pascal wager like calculation.
Yeah, I would agree with you absolutely that Nietzsche was doing that.
Could you elaborate?
Well, just if you define what is true as what is unreasonable, you have performed the same trick that you are saying that the postmodernists are doing from the other side of the equation, by trying to show that their choice of the unreasonable is also untrue.
Is this sort of like, in order to like make that move, you have to first say that, okay, any sorts of reasons that we might have for some sort of action are all illusory in some sense. Like, we have this conception that we have a causal sui, free will, some sort of homunculus within us that drives us to do certain things, when in fact we're mostly acting off of our gut, and that's what's most real. And it's like, there's no reasoning behind any of that.
Right. The reasoning is a post hoc calculation as opposed to a pre.
So it's not unreasonable, it's a reasonable.
Yeah, that might be a better way to phrase it. But right, if we accept that, then it really does make Pascal's wager much harder to clearly delineate in a meaningful way. We start ending up much more in something like Bayesian, statistics. And then we're kind of back in the same muddy ground that we started in.
But if you rephrase the question, I think it still holds. You can stop asking, what would you prefer? Which state would you prefer? A state where there is an objective reality, or one where there isn't?
Asking what seems to be getting away
it's
from
a good
the
one in the Matrix, right?
Objectivity. Yeah.
It depends how much I like this non-existent steak.
Yeah, it seems if that's our sort of basis for decision making, that seems to be hard to say is like we're in line with objective or absolute truth, because it just seems like we're acting off of what our preferences are, which doesn't necessarily have to align with reality.
Right. But then you get to the situation of wishful thinking equaling truth.
Yeah. Right. But there is an aspect to this, because I liked where the conversation was going with. This is how I've tried to parse the problem as well, is putting honesty at the peak of the hierarchy as a pragmatic argument. Honesty is what is most confirmable by necessity as existing as what I am, whatever that is. Now I can make a pragmatic argument from there on the value of truth as that which affords my honesty. But
right. So what I would say is that in being honest, it seems to me that there is a world. Like being honest, the fact that I can be honest about there seems to be a world is a good enough motivation to claim that there is a world. And so that my truth, insofar as I'm being honest about it, must exist objectively in the world insofar as I exist in the objective world.
Right. And that's the other part that's a great point. I wanted to bring that in that, right, there's a bizarre loop where we've overly alienated the subjective and the objective. And if we want to pose either of them, at some point, we have to kind of manage the Ouroboros, damn it.
Yeah, well, the one presupposes the other.
Like shape to the structure we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. Like, you can't have objectivity without subjectivity. You can't have subjectivity without objectivity, basically.
Right.
Hegel was right.
I think you can imagine a situation where you have objectivity without subjectivity, but it wouldn't involve any observers.
Yeah, but how do you imagine
have anything,
without observation?
It wouldn't have any objects.
Your imagination is observation.
Yeah, because that's like transcendental argument for the self is if you have anything that has any sorts of spatial extension, there must be some sort of perspective in which you're looking at the thing with spatial extension, which indicates some sort of subject there.
Yeah. I didn't actually know that he made the argument in terms of spatial expansion. That's very useful to me in terms of Viveki's 4 Ps, because I argue that the space is like the perspectival knowing. So there we go.
Yeah, because you need to have some sort of perspective in which to observe it from. Yeah. Okay. So last little like stretch home is to really figure out like what the tactics, I guess, and it's not necessarily just to like, oh, we're gonna undermine postmodernism from within or anything like that, because I think a lot of this is outside of our control. And so a lot of like what I'm curious of is like, what do I as a single individual, like what should I be doing in regards to the fact the fact of postmodernism's power over society right now? And it's not like maybe we're kind of ramping it up a little bit too much, because there is still I think within most people a modernist understanding of like, yeah, there's things that are true and there's things that are not true. It's not just everything's not just language games that we're playing to try to like overpower other people.
The whole meta-narrative debate is largely over exaggerated by philosophers.
Right.
Well,
go ahead.
No, okay. Well, yeah, I'll go. my response to you, John, is that if you're really looking for something to do in order to combat the scourge of postmodernism, is that you should join the religion that's not a religion project that you sort of helped set off and then just kind of bailed on.
I'm busy, man. Okay.
No,
that...
but seriously, because like this is like it's exactly these problems that we are trying to tackle and to respond to meaningfully. And I don't think that this is an answer that you can just generate within 10 minutes of a video. But
of
like,
course, yeah.
yes, I think that you like there's a lot of validity in the urge that you have and what you're looking for. And I would very much like to see that engaged with other people in a productive way. Okay. So that's what the invitation is to you, because I think that's my answer basically.
Pick your favorite cult and see if it works.
The old Nick route. Yeah.
One realm I've been playing with this question more recently is specifically in the realm of ontological power as opposed to narcissistic power. And I view this as a very large weakness within the common form of the postmodernism. So this would be trying to kind of go through postmodernism, except that basically I see it that the narcissistic seeking of power is the distorted form of seeking ontological security, and any worldview that can legitimately offer ontological security will necessarily win out in the power game that postmodernism is currently playing.
Interesting. That's actually a really strong point, because like, given the world that we live within right now, especially within the US, where having some sort of existential security is becoming more and more hazardous, or what's the term I'm wanting? More and more out of reach, I guess, or unstable. That's the term I was looking for. Any sort of institution or system that can provide that with actual effects, that like observable effects, will, I guess, sort of, what's the term Joseph Henrich uses? Credibility enhancing displays. It would be an excellent credibility enhancing display for that system in order to lead people away from the false systems of security.
Right. Well, and it is, it ties into some ideas I've played around with before, but it is kind of entering into the authenticity hierarchy and trying to, in some sense, climb it to the point that it reverts back into the credibility. Right? Where's the synthesis point between the two hierarchies? And at some level, we have to admit the world we're currently dealing with is functioning on an authenticity hierarchy.
Right.
And the corruption of the authenticity hierarchy is distinctly narcissism.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that in regards to the holding honesty as the primary value. That the way that Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian have been going at this seems like a bad move, because you're just making enemies on their side, because they're recognizing, oh, you're not acting in good faith here. You're trying to undercut the system from without, and we don't like that. So that's automatically going to be making enemies. And I mean, it served a function, but it wasn't serving a function that
it tried to throw back into modernism, and it didn't work, because modernism in a postmodern context looks like another cult.
Right. But I mean it works in a sense, because for all the people outside of the humanities and social academic circle, still within the modernist framework, can observe
justifies
that
the modernist structure.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
For sure. But I don't know.
And
I don't know how long-lived strategies like that will actually.
I mean, like the whole Pluckrose thing, and Boghossian and Lindsay, like they presume that a valuation of objective truth is sufficient to get you through life, and I question that.
To get you through life. Hang on, I don't think that's what they're saying at all. I think they're saying that it's enough to build a society around, not enough to get for an individual to live in.
I mean, Peter Boghossian does have a book titled A Manual for Creating Atheists. So I think there is this implicit assumption that it is something ideal.
I don't see you building a society if you cannot describe or put forward a way of life that an individual cannot follow. Like
Yeah,
those two,
Of course.
you won't
have
get
to
one
live
without the
within a
other.
mythology, I think.
Yeah,
Or a
but the
story
thing
of
is
some
that
sort.
a lot of what has been labeled as modernism and therefore bad by the postmodern era is is not actually something that has been discredited in any serious way. It looks discredited because of sophistry, most of it. So if you can identify the sophistry and point it out where you see it, that could probably do a lot of good in trying to limit the damage that the postmodern confusion does.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an important point. We can't drop modernism. That's where I was like trying to bring truth in as that immediate sub layer that makes honesty valuable.
Yeah.
But it's like you obviously you can't freaking write on your, this is the obvious example, of course, but you can't write on your cell phone about how crappy modernism is.
Well, you can. You're just you're
Yeah,
stuck
the
in a
performative
performative
contradiction is
Yeah,
so
exactly.
on the nose that
Well, I think in a sense it sort of leads to, well, I guess nihilism, of course, but also it's a certain amount of like self-hatred for your own existence. Because like, man, I hate technology and society right now, but yet I live within it. So now I'm like
right.
having
Well,
this
and
clear idea of like what I can't have. Now I'm miserable.
interestingly, going with my Nietzschean frame of ontological versus narcissistic power, there's a very real sense in which we cannot not believe in modernism because it exerts a tremendous amount of
Right.
power phenomenologically over us.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
we can hold these extremely cognitively dissonant states. That's possible for humans, of course, but they don't, they collapse relatively
that's the
quickly.
interesting
Well,
thing.
hang on,
It's like
hang on.
you can have the whole process of science without having to worry about the fact that like, oh, we're not actually establishing a mythology that people can live within. But we
Yeah,
do happen to
I
be
think there's
building resources for like getting us to Mars and the moon and all these other huge institutional breakthroughs.
Yeah, but there's an equivocation going on here because, for example, a Christian wouldn't deny that Satan exists, but yet they don't believe in Satan. Like, there's the acknowledgement that modernism
there?
exists doesn't entail a belief in modernism, right? So there is a and it's small. I would say most people are they're like, it is a performative contradiction, but there's at least a small window of opportunity where it wouldn't be a performative contradiction to sit on a cell phone and say, well, modernism is a bunch of total crap. Like, if you're self-aware about the fact that modernism created the cell phone and you don't actually like the cell phone, but you're just using it out of misery because you've got no other alternative, that's not exactly a performative contradiction.
No, you're right about that.
Yeah.
And that's what people get when they start adopt this framework.
It might not be a performative contradiction, but it's still hypocritical at some really, like, again, if we're bringing honesty back in, it's like,
only
to your point
as
with
you
Satan
have
and
a
the
choice.
Christian, it's like, it's one thing to say, I don't believe in Satan, and it's another to go around constantly and intentionally, doing behaviors that you consider to be inspired by Satan. Now, you can give all of the weight of your responsibility and honesty and throw it at Satan, but it rings.
But the counterpoint is like, okay, so if the government is Satan, right, you can't overthrow the government. So Satan's dominion, you are forced to contend with Satan's dominion over the world, hypothetically speaking.
Right.
The cell phone is the same way, because the fact that I mean, yes, the technology is so powerful, but it also captures people because you're imprisoned. You can only meaningfully communicate to many people through social media these days, or like the viability of living like an Amish person is diminishing. Like, okay, and hypothetically 1 or 2 people could do it. 7 billion people can't. Like, right. That's where the tension hits, I think. And the fact that we're caught within a modernist lens isn't necessarily something that people are happy about.
Especially with concerns of like China developing some sort of artificial intelligence before we do. Like, if we step out of the modernist game, then we're just setting ourselves up for failure. So like, whatever it is that we're going to be doing, if we want it to last existentially, then we're going to have to be whatever it is that we're doing will have to have some of the benefits and utility of modernism. But it's going to still have to have some, because right now there's like this strange diversion or division between the modernist sort of factual scientific way of understanding reality, and then the human-centric, anthropocentric requirements, existential need, or sorry, not existential needs, but psychological needs that people have in order to be a living being. And like there needs to be some sort of like convergence between these two different positions, and right now we don't have it.
No. Why stop there, John? Why not just also add the fact that if the major powers get into a serious conflict, we'll annihilate each other through nuclear winter? It's like,
yeah, exactly.
Like a conflict is literally too costly for anybody to consider.
Well,
it's inconceivable. Like, unless you're crazy, it's inconceivable. It's a no-win scenario.
Now we're back at Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other ways of like existentially wiping us out besides nuclear winter. I mean, you can develop certain
but the fact of the matter is, like, America and China have nukes, right? If they get into a serious fight, they're using the nukes, and we're all fucked. So like, this is the thing, is like, okay, so you're worried about China, and their modernism and their AI and all of this, but like,
that's fair.
Just to escalate.
There's probably the bigger concern is the fight is not within flesh and blood, but within ideas that we're having to face, and it's not even just ideas, but also habits that we're locked into. Like for some reason, we're still scrolling through Facebook and getting angry at everyone else, but we're still doing it for some reason.
To try to bring this down to earth again, you may remember that a lot of postmodernists thought that the solution to the meta-narrative failure that we discussed was to look at local narratives. So look at the local experience and see what seems right there. And that's not a completely horrible idea. I mean, you can find a lot of things that work around you. The question is, what does that imply about the bigger things? And I think they can find by looking at local narratives that a lot of the meta-narratives are onto something.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, that's sort of like Peterson's response as well. Like, if there is some sort of broader narrative that makes my own existence meaningless, well, that's an indication that the broader narrative is not the type of narrative that I ought to be living according to. But the follow-up response to that is that our local narratives have derivative power because of the broader narrative that this narrative exists within. And so if the broader narrative is nihilism or something like that, then any sort of like meaning that you might try to found underneath that is just going to be...
The criticism against that optimism within postmodernism is that there's actually no way to tell the difference between a meta-narrative and a local narrative without applying a meta-narrative.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't. How's that really a criticism though? It's just the fact that like if postmodernism says like all meta narratives are false, then
it's more like they say we don't feel like we can trust any meta narratives anymore. So it basically states of nihilism where nothing is trustworthy, and this minor spark of optimism exists within it, but it counters itself. Still, it's something that to be considered from the outside if you want to be more pragmatic about it.
I would say that the meta-narrative issue, as long as you don't attempt to hold to an absolute, then it survives. It's the meta-narratives that proclaim access to the absolute that fail. And the issue is that basically all of the theist narratives that we inherited made claims with respect to access to the absolute.
And all of them failed too.
Yeah. But so the way out there is to, as I say once again, it's the more modest honesty versus absolute truth position, because at least
but it's still unfair to apply this to equally to things like Christianity and to things like capitalism.
Why?
Because one of them makes the claim that it's the best way to generate wealth. Okay, that's one thing. Sure, maybe. The other one lays claim to a method that corrects itself when it discovers it's an error, and therefore approaches something that is going to be reliable, as truth is reliable.
No, I disagree with you there, because I mean, yes, okay, so capitalism makes the argument that capitalism is the best way to make wealth. But it's also arguing that the best way to live is to try to be wealthy. And that's the narrative, because then the capitalist narrative says we're all trying to speak to each other within the framework of trying to be wealthy.
Actually,
that's where
I don't even think that capitalism is actually a meta-narrative in that sense. It was just one example that's brought to mind. It's more
Okay,
like capitalism is what the people who don't like that people employ the free market, and the consequence of that call this process.
I think it implicitly endorses that meta-narrative, and just merely by the fact that it rewards people that act in certain ways by providing them with monetary income. And so, like, anyone has a brain that's watching how things are going, like, oh, I see that Jeff Bezos is the most powerful person in the world. I want to be powerful too. I guess I got to play the Jeff Bezos game, something like that. And so that's the meta narrative that is emergent, I guess, from capitalism.
Yeah, you can say something like that, but that's still very separate from the processes that give rise to this, I would say.
Well,
because the processes aren't really a system so much as it's just not interfering.
I think I get Trygve's point insofar as he said that capitalism wasn't a meta-narrative, because I would agree with that. And I would also agree with the fact that well, it gets complicated. Like, there is an aspect of capitalism that is part of a meta-narrative, but it's more accurate to say that notion of capitalism is really Protestantism. So, okay, it gets a bit iffy, but if we don't get into the weeds there, I would at least say that the postmodernists have a tendency to criticize everything in terms of, oh, well, we're deconstructing the meta-narrative, and then they apply it to things where there isn't even really a meta-narrative to talk about.
Yeah.
Like, they do go too far. But
Right.
That's beyond question as far as I'm concerned.
So I was originally thinking that, like, maybe there needs to be some sort of merger between postmodernism, because postmodernism manages to point out where modernism fails. But the thing is, postmodernism, as Vervaeke rightly criticizes, doesn't have any sort of corrective mechanism for the problems that it brings forward.
It doesn't believe in corrective mechanisms.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, in order to even have, it's almost like modernism would have to accept postmodernism in order to provide the problems with modernism. But anything that you're going to do to resolve those problems is going to just rely upon modernism again. And so,
yeah,
no.
You might say. Okay, you first.
Where you were saying earlier, splitting the axiology and the ontology is the solution there, because the modernist frame attempts to unite the axiology and the ontology and to say that they are synonymous. That's the mistake. If you split them and you have two different dialogues, then you finally have the position to actually construct a language of axiology that makes sense, that isn't susceptible to postmodernist deconstruction because it tried to articulate itself in terms of ontology.
Actually,
my criticism was that modernism fails to provide any sort of axiology.
Yeah, well, it assumes that the axiology and the ontology are the one and the same thing. So therefore, get to objective truth and everything will be fine.
I don't know if that's an implicit axiom of modernism.
It's, well, if insofar it's an implicit axiom of cultures, of Indo-European cultures.
Yeah, I guess that's right. I don't know. I guess I'm considering modernism as like a complete scientific sort of outlook, but I guess that's probably quite incorrect, because if capitalism is a component or a prospect of modernism, then yeah, it doesn't entail some sort of implicit value to it. So yeah.
I wrote something in the chat.
Do you want to read it?
Sure. Both modernism and capitalism were defined by critics. It might therefore be debatable that they're even appropriate terms for what is being discussed.
Well,
the way I would define capitalism is...
I certainly agree with capitalism, but I'm not so... It seems like it definitely feels like there were modernist thinkers putting forward some sort of system and ideas that relates to one another.
there were optimists in the area from around the Industrial Revolution to say 1920, 1930s, around their first time around, and their critics called themselves modernists, the people who felt the optimists were too optimistic. And then the next wave of criticism happened after the Second World War instead of after the first one, and they called the optimists the modernists.
Weird. All right, sorry.
So-
go ahead, Struan.
I forgot what I was going to say.
Was
I
it
lost
about
it.
capitalism?
Oh yeah, sorry. It was the capitalism. I would say that I think Vivek is right that the capitalism and the Protestant work ethic are more or less the same thing. The idea of working in order to be to attain salvation
wealth.
is an idea that you get once you once you start cutting out all of the Catholic notions of salvation and the rituals and the indulgences. There we go.
Right.
All of that. Well, once that's gone, then the only thing that's left in order to attain virtue is work. And the only way to figure out whether or not your work is paying off is if you're making a profit.
But that is not
Actually,
sola
I'd like
scriptura.
to blame that on Paul.
Blame it all on Paul. Every
repeat,
single Christian
that is
error
not sola scriptura. So it's not strictly Protestant. It might have appeared in the Protestant context, but it's not strictly Protestant. It
sola
might be more
scriptura
understood
isn't in the
as
scripture either, if you want to make that argument.
what did you say?
I say sola scriptura isn't in the scripture either, if you want to make that argument. So sola scriptura isn't Protestant.
Well, it is Protestant, but
no, but
yeah,
I know it was a reduction.
Yeah. It's an overarching idea in the Protestant movements, plural.
I would say that capitalism isn't something that you get out of Christian doctrine or Christian scripture directly. Nevertheless, the Protestant work ethic is what capitalism.
I think probably it's better to understand it as what happens when you take the whole idea of salvation and make it purely spiritual, as you might say that the Protestant movement attempted to do, and then you leave people to their own devices for measures in the life they're in right now, the life that people have a tendency to care about.
Mm-hmm.
And so they try to develop their own way to think about it, and that generated the Protestant work ethic. I think that's a better way to think about it.
There is an interesting aspect of like evolution either arising from or impacting that conception as well, because there is this distinct motion in the Protestant work ethic, and this has been like developed long past Protestantism. But it is that, you can see if you are being spiritually rewarded by how much you are materially rewarded.
Yeah, and that's an ancient idea.
Yeah. It's certainly made a revival with the Protestants.
What is unique about the Protestant version of the idea is that any attempt to attain spiritual salvation is an act of will, which is proof of your damnation.
Hmm.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
The Protestants, they Luther made the argument basically that you had to surrender your will to God. So any attempt to reach salvation on your own is an expression of will. So therefore, your attempt to attain salvation is what damns you. So therefore, you can't try to attain salvation. And the only way then that is left for you to have any kind of relationship with salvation is to is to kind of go into life and to do what you can, because then presumably if God is smiling upon you, then he's going to favor you in life. But you can't try for it, because if you try for it, then you're screwed.
Yeah, it's kind of like the game. You know the internet meme? If you think about it, you lose.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking of Sisyphus moving, carrying that boulder up the mountain, faded to his...
Yeah, it's like Sisyphus doing that, but every single time that he thinks, I'm getting there, the boulder falls down to the bottom, and it's caused by him thinking, I'm almost there.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a bizarre conflation there, in that it seems to be overly presupposing that the physical... Oh my gosh, Kat. The physical laboring is. Are you saying that they placed it there because it was so divorced from the spiritual realm? And then why then does it get reconnected to it?
Well, it's not spiritual salvation. It's the idea that God, you see, because the idea, like the Protestant idea was that God has his elect, right? That the people that he's going to be that he's chosen for salvation. And
Right,
that's his
the
arbitrary
double
will.
predestination. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's that whole idea, but then the Protestants, then they can't seek salvation, but then how do they know if they're one of the chosen? They don't. The idea was that you work, and then if you succeed in life, then that's an indication that actually maybe God favors you. But it's not something that you're doing, it's just God chose you.
Yeah.
That's
Whereas the favor in life
Yeah.
is
That's
something you see in job, for example.
This is why John Vervaeke considers Protestantism to be like it's cultural narcissism, because you force everyone to please look at me, please look at me, please look at me, in so far as the only indication that you can get that you're favored by God is if everybody else adores you because
but
you are
that's
succeeding.
there's an underlying deep failure that I'm assuming came from somewhere else, which is that whole thing only happens if you literally have no phenomenological experience that you could describe as spiritual.
Well, okay,
You
so
have
remember
no way to confirm your actual
That seems
relationship with God
unlikely.
experientially.
No, but the point is that trying to seek that out intentionally is what damns you, right? Because Luther is now going around and closing all the monasteries throughout Christendom as a result of his revolution, right? Because that those are all profane ways of behaving. So you mustn't do that. So the culture at that point loses any kind of connection to that particular idea. I don't disagree with you. You can get that feeling, but trying to get that feeling was what the monasteries and all of that was set up to do.
Right.
Yeah.
So then
And that also, I think, damns the whole idea of the university as a theological project.
How so?
In the sense that the universities were engaged in what they thought of as natural theology, trying to find God in the world, and trying to find and trying to become close to Him in some way through the science, through work. And that was largely the point of universities to begin with. So, which is moving away from as this idea has been abandoned.
Yeah. But that's weird though, because there was such a massive movement towards universities within the Protestant thing.
Yeah, I think
maybe that's
the
one of the
natural
weird things
theology thing or the natural philosophy thing that predates Protestantism. That you have to go back. I mean, the universities arose what in the 14th, 13th centuries.
Yeah.
So they're a lot older than Protestantism.
Well, Luther was in the 16th century, right? Or was it 17th?
Yeah, 16th.
16th.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, like between I'm talking between Thomas Aquinas and Luther. I mean, you know, a lot happened in those few hundred years.
Yeah.
Right, but also there was a clear massive expansion of universities at post-Luther.
Yes, but that
maybe
I
it's
agree with you. What I'm
similar-
saying is that the distinction between the monastery and the university, and that the universities were trying to get to God through natural philosophy, that came about before Protestantism. When Protestantism came about, that whole motion was supercharged because of the lack of the monasteries to counterbalance the universities.
Right. Well, what I was understanding was that this would have been considered under this idea of Protestantism to be just as bad as the monastery, because you're still seeking God.
You're not trying. Yeah, but that's
But
the thing.
you're seeking God in the same way that, like, observing that I'm accumulating wealth indicates I'm one of the elect. You're using.
I think
no. I think that, you see, the thing is that the idea would be that the universities have. They gain real knowledge about this world, the material world, the physical world. They're not interested in knowledge about the spiritual world. Therefore, their knowledge isn't profane, because it's not people trying to reach salvation. It's people trying to understand the world that God made.
Yeah, and this was possible because natural philosophy and natural theology had been largely separated, as the deist movement and more atheistic tendencies came into universities. So you might say it had been discharged from the whole natural theology project by then, because that's one of the things that started happening in that period.
Right. Well, and it is interesting. I mean, like, you do also have the kind of classic battle between, you know, the beginnings of science and the theological.
Yeah, well, I mean, many prominent scientists were also theologians. You know, like in like full blown church positions. You know, and only able to do science because they had the free time afforded to them by their station within the church.
Right. Originally, but now with capitalism, you can still accumulate
there's the fight
through
between
your research.
Yeah, well, then there's the fight between the theology and the philosophy, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the university structures, because then the factions, like the atheists, would basically like reject the theologians and the Christians and try and do it on their own terms.
Right. Well, and they didn't even have to reject I mean, like, if you look at Galileo or Copernicus, or people that where the religious structures viewed it as a detriment to their mythology, because it was shrinking the importance of the earth, even though perhaps the scientists themselves were viewing it as discovering God's creation.
Yeah, so I mean, well, that ultimately that's an argument over authority.
Right.
And I'll just say that I think the mythology surrounding Galileo is sort of overblown in favor and sort of biased in the side of the Enlightenment time. So there's much more political. Yeah, there's much more political.
I think that the best way that I've ever heard that put is that Galileo was the Nicholas Nassim Taleb of his time. That explains everything.
Well,
kind of, yeah, I can sort of see that. Yeah, certainly. Yeah,
like, he had a big mouth. He pissed off the Pope. Like that much is like he could have been more diplomatic. He chose not to. He's like Nicholas Nassim Taleb.
Like, he had a friend in the Pope that like, yeah, I want you to actually write about these ideas, and so he does it, and then he writes a dialogue, and then the other person in the dialogue has like a name that is akin to like foolish one or something like that. So the person that's arguing against his theory of heliocentrism is just like a complete straw man, an idiot, and then like it like completely put the name of the I think the bishop that stood up for him.
That's a good way to make enemies.
Yeah, it's perfect. And then like there's a lot more to that story than just the way that the Enlightenment sort of talks about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and there's the whole weird thing where, like, given the time and the level of, clear obstruction to the church that Galileo was displaying, his actual punishment does not match how they were treating other disruptors at the time. So they clearly had some deep sense of value in what he was doing, and nonetheless,
right.
But they wanted his work, but they didn't want his personality, perhaps.
Yeah, just like Taleb. All right. I don't know. Is there any other like particular points that we want to sort of touch on? It's already been 2.5 hours now, so.
Yeah, I stayed up way later than I intended.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's 5
I'm done.
At least it's the weekend, though. Oh, yeah. I said I could go to 5 a.m. till I got tired. I'm not really tired right now since I took a nap, but I do want to be conscious of our audience members.
It's going to be fun to go back and look at the replay and look at your hair, like from when you first started and like all that time. Yeah. The aggravation is quite apparent by now.
No, I just keep on like seeing myself in the camera and like, oh man, my hair is weird. I usually I like to wet it and spike it, but now my hair's like getting too long and it's just getting heavy and it looks stupid.
Yeah.
So
I'm not the only one who needs a shave soon or a haircut.
Yeah.
Blame the COVID crisis.
No, I blame my own laziness. That's usually what it is.
But what I was going to say is, I mean, it just points to like, yeah, you were ready to go for all of this time, but like all of the hair pulling now, it's like, you know, you've been worn a bit thin.
It just appears that way. It's not. Yeah, I mean, this is like invigorated me now, so like I probably won't sleep for another hour and a half probably after this. But I do take your point quite strongly there, Struan, that like if I do want to pose any sort of threat against the scourge that is postmodernism to to our society, yeah, I will attempt. That's the thing. Discord has been such a like huge fiasco. Like I'm looking at my all the groups I'm part of right now. And there's like 8 different notifications, some of them having like 20 plus on them. And like, there's too much. It's like
just clear them all out and then
that's what I got to do is like delete all the ones I don't care about. I'm not going to participate in, and only like probably the Vanderclay server and the Maps and Meet or Waking from the Meaning Crisis. And of course our own server, the Beverly community. But
yeah, that's 3. That's plenty.
Yeah,
but if you leave my server, hey.
Oh yeah, I'll delete your server first.
Yeah, like you could go. I probably will decommission that at some point, in the not too distant future. So,
that's a stupid thing. Is like everybody just makes their own Discord server now. It's like anybody that's online, they've got a Discord server, and it's like, do we need this? Like, I don't want 25 Discord servers that I'm a part of just to sort of interact with people. But
if it's any consolation, I don't have one yet.
Well, you should make one. What are you talking about? Yeah, you do. You have your symbolic server. What is it? The symbolism. Isn't that your server? Oh, sorry. No, I'm talking to Struan.
Yeah.
Struan's got a server. Trygve doesn't.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I mean, I only created that because they wouldn't give me a channel in like the Bridges meeting. I was really annoyed I'm still annoyed about that to this day, actually. Like it deserved its own channel.
I want to go off on my esoteric symbolism.
It was called the forum.
Say again?
I said you got the forum.
The forum?
On the
main general channel.
Oh, yeah. Bloody hell, I forgot about that.
Plays anyway. Just endlessly argue.
But I do have an idea that I will bring forward actually to the Bridges of Meaning community, because I do think they'll probably appreciate it quite a bit. And I'll just say it here publicly as well. For anybody that's lasted 2 hours and 36 minutes through this dense conversation, I'll be part. The Beverly community is starting a new channel that is going to be about just a public resource for people to listen to different papers that are out there in the wild, whether they be Wikipedia articles or philosophical articles from like the SEP or IEP or something like that, or even just like scientific papers that are out there. Anyone that is interested can read and record themselves reading one of these articles or papers and submit it to the channel, and we will upload it so that it can be up there for anybody to just be able to listen to on their own. Sort of like LibriVox, where people will like voluntarily read chapters from a book that's out of copyright condition, but we're just focusing on any sort of like papers that are out there. And I think it could provide a valuable resource for people in that nobody's got time to actually read a paper, even if it's something that you're interested in. It's like, I'm never going to actually sit down, devote 20 to 30 minutes to just read a paper. But but if I can just sit while I'm driving, I can listen to the luxurious voice of someone reading a paper to me, then that will at least provide me with that resource in a much more efficient and what's the word I'm wanting? Exploitable way, I guess. I don't know.
Of all the words.
yeah. I was trying to think of like what is the term when you can like generalize it for a lot of people. Like a lot more people can be able to utilize
the barrier
this.
of entry, or
Yeah. I think exploitable works actually.
That's true.
But yes, so that will be the Beverly Reading channel, and starting next week, I'm going to start having people read and upload, and we'll be uploading different papers. And it's really any types of papers that people are interested. I'm wanting to get like at least 3 different papers read out and up there on the channel per week, so that there's going to be a lot of different topics. So if there's
You'll be doing Mein Kampf first, won't you?
Yes, yeah. Well, that's not
That's
really
a
a
good
paper. Maybe the Unabomber manifesto. Actually, that's already up online. I was listening to that on YouTube earlier, a couple weeks ago. But yeah, smaller papers mostly, but even like Wikipedia articles. And what was the suggestion you had made, Struan, or maybe it was Trygve? I can't recall.
It was me.
Yeah.
Cultural studies.
Right. The Wikipedia article on cultural studies, that could be a really valuable resource for people. And I don't know. I think that the Bridges of Meaning people might benefit from that, and perhaps would be willing to participate and submit readings of their own. So I'll have to reach out to them about that.
I'm sure the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis would also be pretty stoked on that situation.
Didn't I say that? Oh, I said Bridges of Meaning. Yeah.
Bridges
I don't know, maybe they'll be
probably
interested.
less likely to make use of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I meant the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Everybody's like all about meaning nowadays. It's just like hard to keep everything straight. But
it's such a mean thing to be so obsessed about.
It's racketeering 101.
You know, this pod's starting to get a little bit meaningless. Maybe we should drop it.
It's the typical cult move, you know, like they rack you in and like, what are you missing in your life? You know what you're missing? Meaning.
And
That's
something
right.
as ephemeral as meaning.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, it's in today's modern age, it really is the resource that is nowhere to be found.
Now, what we're really missing is modernism.
Maps of modernism. That's what we.
That's fired.
All right. That's an excellent conversation, though. I am going to end the stream. So my appreciation to everyone that is listening back to this in the future. My additional appreciation to all of our participants, Trygve and Ben popped in, and Struan, and as well Nick. Again, sorry Nick for not inviting you earlier. I should have figured that you were just waiting in the chat, sort of like, oh, I'm participating through text, but you probably wanted to join in and actually verbalize it.
It was kind of fun to play the background voice from nowhere.
Right.
But yes, I also enjoy. I think I do a little bit better in speech.
Absolutely. And what
I think so too.
What we'll want to do is probably get this group around together again. It's really not that bad for me. I like a lot of Friday nights. I'll tend to stay up till 5 a.m. anyway, so it's not too bad on my part. But just because both Struan and Trygve are in a different time zone, we had to accommodate them, and I do not mind. I would be more than willing to do this again. But all right, thank you everyone for joining us, and good night.
Good night.
Here we go.